I enjoyed the cigar cohiba and a mesmerizing sunset over the Aegean Sea, sitting in the cockpit of your yacht Argo. Argo is a 42-foot Bermuda-rigged sailboat from Beneteau, spacious and fast, with a deep keel for excellent upwind tacking capabilities. The day before I crossed Corfu on the Adriatic side, ventured through the daunting walls of the Corinth Canal and stopped for the night in Kaya. Key is located in the Saronic Gulf at the very edge of the Attic Peninsula. I decided to stop there because navigating at night with so many ships leaving Athens is a bad idea. In the morning, I set off across a sea Homer described as dark as wine, heading for the #1 party island in the Cyclades, Mykonos. I now have all the time in the world. Therefore, squeezing out a couple of extra knots while adjusting the main sheet seemed to me to be unnecessarily tedious. Instead, I settled down in the shade of the tent with a cold bottle of Mythos and enjoyed the magic of the fabulous Aegean sun. Thanks to the Meltemi north winds, I reached Turlos Marina on Mykonos by the end of the day. The Mykonos clubs were on the beach, not far from where I docked, but I had no desire to go there. In fact, I didn't want to interact with humanity at all. I just sat in the gathering twilight, sipping a shot of Lagavulin 16 and thinking about how my life had changed since the fiery apocalypse that ended it so painfully. I was a happy archaeologist, and my wife, Lisa, taught ancient studies at a liberal arts college on the East Coast. I know this sounds like the life of two nerds living in poverty, but archaeology can make good money if you find the right things, especially if you're not too picky about who you sell them to. The Saudis are especially generous with this. They are ready to outbid each other for items dating back to the dawn of Western civilization. Of course, people who are appropriating cultural heritage, they start to get nervous if they find out that you are making money from their artifacts. But I was connected to a network of dealers who kept me at the long end of a complex supply chain. So Leonidas' diadem made me an instant multimillionaire. Gerard Butler is one thing, but the historical Leonidas was a real king, and he took some amazing things with him to Thermopylae. All this remained there thanks to the Persians, who killed him and all his Spartan hoplites. Over the next decade, the Persians were busy trying to destroy Western civilization, and the Greeks were busy trying to save it. Therefore, no one wasted time searching for Leonid's treasures, and all these Spartan trophies lay untouched for 2,400 years. I became rich because Leonidas left his personal belongings in the Greek camp, and not where he died, on the hill of Colon. I found this camp using Herodotus, not the modern metal detectors and ground-penetrating radars that are so popular in archaeology today. Old Herodotus wrote that the Greeks camped in Alpenoch, on the shore of Mayakovskogo Bay. The problem is that the coastline from the time of the Battle of Thermopylae is literally a few miles from the modern one. So I spent the summer digging trenches along what I calculated to be an ancient coastal line. It was useful that I could use the location where the battle itself took place to determine the old coastline. The site of the Battle of Thermopylae is marked by a wall built by the Greeks more before the war with the Persians. It indicates the width of the narrow passage that the Spartans defended. This wall still stands there after 25 centuries. The narrowing of the passage was limited from the north by waters Maliakskogo Bay and from the south by Mount Calidromo. The ancient coastline can still be clearly identified by sedimentary layers and marine remains. Searching along it required a lot of digging and sweat, but I was very motivated by recent events in my life. All the other archaeologists thought I was crazy because the site was almost a mile from where I was digging. So it felt like I was digging around in a farmer's field to no avail. I didn't try to dissuade them because I knew what I had found. On a slight rise to the west of the old shoreline, I made an educated guess that this was where Leonidas might have set up his camp. I knew I had it right when our trenches began to reveal the remains of camp life, everything that an occupied Greek hoplite might have left behind, including what was in their latrines. When we excavated the first skeleton, I realized that I had found the site of Leonidas' tent. 300 elite Spartans died at Thermopylae, but with them was a large group of helots. The helots were not warriors, they were Spartan slaves. Everyone died. But the helots died in the camp and not on Colon Hill, where the last battle took place. We found a significant number of bones in one place, indicating that we were in the center of the camp. I had a feeling that I would unearth something valuable, and I didn't want anyone to know about it. So I sent the Greek workers home. I knew what happened the last time I trusted people, and I didn't want a repeat. Leonidas was one of the two kings of Sparta. Although Spartan warriors led an ascetic lifestyle, Leonidas did not walk around in oil and shorts, as in the 27 film. He had all the trappings of power, including a diadem of pure gold with a huge lapis lazuli in the center. He wore it to inspire his troops. I found this tiara in a dilapidated oak box under the skeleton of a man who died defending her. After that, I had a choice. I could know. I had to hand over my discovery to the authorities. The diadem of Leonidas was a priceless historical artifact. It was worn by a cultural hero whose name has survived centuries. In fact, Leonidas in many ways symbolized the triumph of courage and self-sacrifice over totalitarianism, so her symbolic value was immeasurable. But I was alone in the windy field, the object of ridicule for my fruitless attempts to dig empty farmland that no one else considered important, and the victim of a cruel betrayal. Best of all, no one knew I had found anything. Karma owed me. Ask yourself, how immoral would you have to be to make yourself fabulously rich by simply putting something you're holding in your bag instead of turning it over to the authorities because it's the right thing to do? To be honest, I wasn't particularly tormented by this issue, which probably makes me a bad person, but also a very rich one. The myth of shady artifact dealers selling looted art is more fiction than fact. But in the world of antiques, there are plenty of dubious people with useful contacts. They swarm around the excavations like vultures, so I just had to give a hint. This sparked a huge vanity contest among the super rich. I let them outbid each other until the price reached 47 million, which was just pocket money for one oil sheikh. I heard that the buyer was delighted because he associated himself with the other side, that is, with the Persians. He liked the idea of owning the crown of the one who destroyed their grandiose plans. After the commission, I hid 45 million with our harsh friends, the Swiss. Seriously, the IRS can be so greedy. My only goal was to disappear from everyone's radar. I became a new person born again without the emotional burden of my past life. The story of my betrayal is banal to the point of boredom. I met Lisa at Dzukowski's school. This was not a chance meeting. There were only about a dozen students in Brown's Archaeology department, and we all needed field research to graduate. Lisa and I spent the summer digging, clearing, and sifting in the villa of Quintus Horace Flaccus in Wacone, Italy. Lovers of Roman culture call him Horace and consider him the leading romantic poet of the Augustan era. Vacon is in the Apennines, about 40 miles from Rome. It's hilly, not flat like the Latin plain, where Rome is located. Therefore, this place served as a pleasant and green refuge for the Roman aristocracy, escaping the heat and smells of the big city. Lisa studied in several of my courses. I knew her as an ordinary nerd girl, wrapped in warm clothing to survive the Providence weather. But despite the altitude, it was hot in Lazio in the summer, and I saw a completely different Lisa. Wearing a sweaty t-shirt and short denim shorts, she carefully cleaned the mosaics in the villa's bathhouse. This diligent student turned into a Roman goddess. Broad shoulders, muscular back, and toned hips, he shouted about fertility. Two large breasts, outlined through the wet fabric, completed the picture. My interest was piqued instantly. Lisa might have an ordinary face, but with a body like that I could hardly look any higher than her neck. Lisa and I had hardly crossed paths before, but we had never spoken. Her double major in classical studies meant that her interests were more humanitarian than mine. My specialty was the study of Roman building techniques, so I worked on the foundations of the cryptoporticus of the first terrace, which placed Lisa and me on opposite sides of the site. I went down into her trench, pretending to be interested in her work. The trench was about 5 feet deep at the level of the Roman layer. Lisa nodded to me in greeting. I said in my friendliest voice, "We bump into each other all the time, but I've never introduced myself." Then he added, "We're both from the same school, so I thought it was worth at least telling me my name." I extended my hand and said, Ryan. Lisa blushed deeply, stood up, extended her hand to me, and said quietly, Lisa. Her incredible shyness was an interesting detail. It was the first time I really looked at her. Lisa was invisible at home. Of course, I had never seen her body before because it was always hidden under sweaters and other warm clothes. She didn't wear makeup or do anything to her hair, so my visual sensors just weren't working. Men are known to value visual perception. I mean, seriously, do you think that the Sports Illustrated edition sells so many swimsuit issues thanks to our interest in swimming? But then I saw that Lisa had an ordinary face, but a simply amazing body. Her nose was a little long, but overall she had every chance of becoming a beauty. Her brown hair was pulled back into a thick braid, reaching to the shoulder blades. Real peasant hair is thick and lush. However, now she looked like she wanted to be anywhere but here, talking to me. I tried to start a conversation. He offered her a sip of water from his bottle and said, I am working on the foundations of the peristyle columns. There is less work with brushes, but you have to dig a lot more. And it's damn hot. Lisa smiled reservedly, accepting the bottle, and answered, Thank you. Here in the trench, there is no wind at all. Her sweaty t-shirt, tightly fitting her figure, was clear evidence of this. I said at ease as if I just came up with this. Hey, let's have dinner at Only for Do and compare your notes. We, students, lived in different hostels in Wacone, and there was a decent restaurant to the east of the digs. Lisa blushed even more and said, I'm not at all dressed for a restaurant. It was interesting to watch how embarrassment and desire battled on her face. I reassured her. Come on. Italians generally don't have dinner until the chickens go to bed. The heat subsides only at 9 in the evening, so this is the usual time for dinner. I added. You will have enough time to change clothes. That evening, I saw a completely different Lisa. This was not the same girl who studied with me at the faculty. She knew how to use makeup and knew how to dress for the occasion. It wasn't anything overly fancy. But my God, this woman had an amazing figure. We mainly talked about our projects. Lisa gladly shared her finds and delights. Her passion working on the mosaic floor was infectious. I understood her feelings because this is what brought me into archaeology. When working with ancient artifacts, you feel the touch of things that were last touched 2,000 years ago by people who lived in a completely different, but still similar world. And this feeling of connection with that distant, like an era transmitted through your fingertips. Seriously, it took 14 centuries for our civilization to re-achieve the level of social, organizational, and technical sophistication that the Romans had. So you always feel this connection between our time and theirs. It permeates everything you study, from art to construction technology. Maybe we can even learn something from what ended up happening to them. Lisa was less interested in the ancient artifacts than in Horace himself. This man was the Roman equivalent of Eliot or Angelou, or, to put it in modern terms, a rock star on the level of Mick Jagger or Taylor Swift. His work has lived for 20 centuries. For Lisa, being able to touch his life through the mosaic tiles in his bathhouse was an almost sacred experience. Yes, it sounds terribly boring, and I admit it. We were both nerds. But I was a tall and relatively attractive guy, and Lisa, if you close your eyes to her slightly long nose, was a real beauty. Everyone knows that feeling when a romantic spark occurs instantly, and this was one of those times. By the time we left the restaurant, we were both in love, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, in the grip of lust. Lisa lived in a women's hostel, and I lived in a men's hostel, a little higher up the slope in Wacone. But on the way to the city, there were secluded wooded places where a guy and a girl could stop to indulge in passionate kisses. By the time we got to her hostel, we had already become a couple. After that, Lisa and I were practically never separated. We got married right after graduation, and Lisa received an offer to teach at a liberal arts college in Connecticut. Archaeology teaching positions are incredibly rare, but I was able to secure a research assistant position at a nearby prestigious Ivy League university. When you live with the most interesting woman in the world, you don't need much communication with other people. Don't get me wrong. Lisa had no interest in bowling, hiking, or shooting ranges. We weren't that kind of people. Our lives revolved around intelligence and knowledge. This is the world in which all nerds live. Lisa was an avid reader. Its only concession to modernity was the Kindle. I read as much as she did, and we often sat on our small balcony with a bottle of wine, discussing all the interesting things we read. It was a secluded life, just me and her. But Lisa gave me all the company I needed. We had an endless space of human experience to discuss, and we explored this world with the same zeal that tourists explore mountain trails. To understand our connection, we need to accept that people are different. Most of you will find an evening discussing the evolution of democratic institutions in classical Athens boring or even strange. But for us, it was fun. That's how nerd love works. We were two outcasts who found each other, and that was our version of destiny. However, it is worth mentioning that, despite the image of a shy nerd girl with glasses, my wife turned into a real tigress in the dark. I don't know about you, but I've always believed that intelligence makes sex better. Smart women understand their feelings and can express them in a way that pleases both themselves and their partner. Lisa was living proof of this. She might be shy and unsure of herself, but she loved sex, and her body, with its amazing contrasts, wide but graceful, full but slender, greedy but generous, only added to this passion. Lisa was not the type of woman who was content with making love once a week. I asked her about it, and we had an open enough connection to talk about such topics. She explained, "Other men have never awakened in me such desire as you. It's something instinctive. Maybe it's the subconscious impulse of motherhood. Women need to have sex frequently to conceive children. But this must necessarily be with the man whom we have chosen as the father of our future children. I think this is an instinct to care for offspring." This response was especially ironic considering what happened later. Whatever the reason, those endorphins released during sex kept us on a constant emotional wave. And let's immediately clarify, this was the case in the first years of our marriage, but even then I understood that such a physical relationship as Lisa and I could not last forever. Nobody who teaches classical studies gets rich, but this is not why we chose this area. We did this because we couldn't imagine that let's get busy doing something else, and the quality of life compensated for everything that we lost in income. By then, we had a cozy little two-bedroom house in the New Haven suburbs, and our careers were thriving. Lisa got a permanent position, and I earned a good enough reputation that funding for my research was always available. Money for archaeology comes from two sources: government grants or private donations from wealthy individuals. I usually worked on archaeological research council projects, mostly within the university, but occasionally advised on student expeditions. Since my major was in classical Greece, I led summer expeditions to Greece like the one where I met Lisa. Lisa always accompanied me, since she herself worked in this field, but we just wanted to be together. Of course, it was completely not bad. What with my current excavation, the place was in Akrotiri on the island of Thera, which is called Santorini in cruise brochures. Santorini is shaped like an inverted C. The part of the island that attracts tourists is at the top of C, and our excavation site is at the very bottom. The island of Santorini is what remains of a much larger island that was purchased to its current form when the central volcano exploded around 1600 BCE. The tsunami caused by this eruption became the basis of legends about Atlantis and the biblical flood. The explosion almost destroyed the nearby Minoan civilization. Lisa and I lived in a spacious apartment, while the students were accommodated in various hostels. This was my first year working in ancient Akrotiri. We lived in modern Akrotiri, which is on the caldera side of the island. The ancient city of Akrotiri, located on the ocean side, was only a few minutes' walk away. Every day we got to the excavations along what the locals called a road, but it was more like just a good goat trail. Ancient Akrotiri was buried in ash during a volcanic eruption. The burial took place so quickly that the complex frescoes, pottery, furniture, and even the advanced drainage system were preserved in perfect condition, just like those of Pompeii. Excavation of a city buried under 10 feet of pumice was hard work. especially considering that all the material from the excavations had to be sifted so as not to miss anything. There is evidence that, unlike Pompeii, the inhabitants of ancient Akrotiri managed to evacuate in time. No human remains or valuables were found. The main thing they left behind was ceramics and incredible wall paintings. My main goal at the Akrotiri excavation was to train students in excavation techniques. But to our surprise, we discovered a small golden idol hidden under the floor of one of the ancient houses. This find attracted the attention of the donor who financed the project, and he flew to Santorini. Peter Paul was a man with two names, but none of the virtues of Peter or Paul. He made his money by getting his way by any means necessary: deception, betrayal, and the classic double game. One might call him immoral if that concept were even applicable to someone like Paul. In fact, Paul was the living embodiment of the modern great sociopath. Paul was the epitome of brutality in male form. Large, handsome, and charismatic, he did what he wanted and defied anyone who tried to stop him. Archaeology interested him minimally. He considered intellectuals to be smart guys and losers. But the image that he created by financing projects like mine was worth the pennies that he spent on it. My discovery of the little horned idol changed the situation for Paul, because it brought him those 15 minutes of fame that he so craved. Naturally, Paul was the center of attention, so I received an invitation, a challenge, actually, to join the great man on his yacht for a presentation of the facility, which, of course, would be broadcast in the media. The main city of the island is called Fira by locals and Santorini by tourists. You probably know what Santorini looks like because there is a picture of it in every Greek restaurant in the world. Akrotiri is located 7 miles south of Santorini. So Lisa and I got into our little Fiat 500 and drove to the meeting place with Paul's representative. Neither Lisa nor I were able to dress appropriately. We were only ready to work on excavations. I was in a safari shirt and jeans, and Lisa was in a modest yellow summer dress with her signature braid. We were both very tanned. Lisa, with her smooth round shoulders peeking out from the neckline of her dress, and her long, beautiful legs, clearly attracted attention. Santorini, with its snow-white houses and blue-tiled roofs, is located on a cliff several hundred meters above the caldera. We met Paul's representative at the top station of the cable car that leads down the caldera walls to the sea. Paul's personal motorboat, a polished mahogany 1946 Chris Craft, was waiting for us at the dock. I helped Lisa climb into the passenger compartment in the back, and Paul's representative sat in front, in the driver's seat, like a real driver. The sea off the coast of Santorini appears to be a bay because it is surrounded by a chain of islands that form the edges of the caldera. These islands were formed after the central part of the ancient island exploded 3,600 years ago. The water is calmer closer to Nikamni, inside the caldera where the dormant volcano is located. There was a whole flock of cruise ships on the water. Our target was moored among them. Paul's yacht was not one of the 800 feet class like cruise ships, but her length was at least 200 feet. Approaching it, it seemed that we were approaching the Titanic. The Chris craft was moored to a platform at water level that jutted out from the stern of the yacht. He met us there with one more assistant, Paul. Both assistants wore uniforms similar to naval white suits. The second man led us up the stairs to the luxurious central salon on the main deck. We were asked to sit down and offered drinks. We refused. I wanted to concentrate, but Lisa looked visibly frightened both by the situation and by the prospect of meeting Paul himself. Paul's appearance happened almost immediately, as if it had been planned in advance. We must give him his due. He was truly charismatic. I think part of his charm was his absolute confidence in being the alpha male in any room. But Paul was also a master at reading people. He was my height, which is quite tall. But Paul was on the heavy side, about 250 pounds 113 kilograms, while my 210 pounds 95 kilograms came from a lean runner's body. Paul immediately saw that Lisa and I were nervous. Therefore, he portrayed a friendly smile, which, however, did not reach his eyes, and came up to greet us. First, he extended his hand to me and said, "It is an honor to meet you, Professor." It was a pure gesture of nobility. He didn't know my name or anything about me. Paul then turned to Lisa. "My wife is easy to underestimate because her face does not have classical beauty." But Paul clearly knew how to look at attractive figures. He fell silent mid-sentence. Lisa, with visible excitement, extended her trembling hand to him, which he took in a warm one. Two-handed capture, and said with false sincerity and something else in his voice, "It's very nice to meet such a beautiful young woman." Lisa looked like she was about to pass out. Paul pointed to the section of the couch behind us and said, speaking exclusively to Lisa, "Sit down with me and tell me about the artifact. The live broadcast will begin in a few minutes." He pointed to the center of the cabin, where the television crew was setting up equipment. Then he led Lisa to the seat next to her, while motioning for me to sit opposite them. I should have said something, but I think each of you has had moments when everything happens too quickly and you can't keep up with the developments. This is exactly what happened to me. So I did the civilized thing instead of starting an argument with Paul because he was stealing my wife's attention. Later, I realized that this was one of his tricks. Societies expect people to follow certain rules of conduct, such as being polite. This is drilled into us from childhood. Paul skillfully used congenital, the politeness of people to get what he wanted. However, at that moment, it did not seem to me to be a big problem. I thought he was arrogant, and he didn't care at all. I took a small drawstring pouch from my shirt pocket and opened it. He shook out the horned idol into his hand and placed it on the black velvet bag. I heard a sigh of surprise. Even Paul was impressed. The object was so beautiful and unusual that its ancient origin was felt by itself. The idol was tiny, only 12 centimeters high and 9 centimeters long. It was made from untreated gold, so it did not shine as brightly as modern gold products. It was made in the shape of a goat with unusually long pointed horns. I said, trying not to sound too preaky. This creature has been identified as a Nubian ibex. They are found exclusively in Africa, indicating that the idol is of Egyptian origin. This is extremely important because it proves the existence of maritime trade between the civilizations of the southern Mediterranean 400 years before the Trojan War. Paul looked puzzled, so I added, "You know, Homer, the Iliad." Paul still looked confused and perhaps a little annoyed, so I clarified. 16 centuries before the birth of Christ. It seemed to get through to him. At this moment, someone from the television crew interrupted us with the words, "We're ready, Mr. Paul." Without even giving me a glance, Paul simply grabbed the idol and hurried to take his place next to the host to begin the interview. I was left sitting with my mouth open, shocked by his behavior. What happened next lasted about 20 minutes. The program was hosted by a famous American journalist specializing in documentary programs about adventures. He carefully guided Paul through discussions of ancient Akrotiri, the Santorini volcano, and the significance of the find to our understanding of the ancient world. Paul used my exact words to describe the meaning of the idol, ending. This proves that the seafaring skills of the ancients were much more advanced than anyone knew. My name was never mentioned. Paul concluded the interview by announcing that refreshments would be served in the salon. The television crew and press immediately rushed to the food. I watched all this in a state of complete bewilderment. Seriously, appropriating someone else's work so openly was so out of bounds that I just sat there like a fool. Well, who in their right mind could be so selfish and unceremonious, right? Then I looked at Lisa and saw that she was completely fascinated by Paul. What the hell did that mean? I said lightly, irritably. "Come back to reality, dear. I need to talk to our patron." I stood up, ready to rush into Paul's dining room to put everything in its place. Lisa still looked like she had been hit in the head. I asked, with increasing irritation in my voice, "What's wrong with you?" Lisa replied admiringly, "This man is simply amazing. Each of us is limited in our capabilities. We may focus on just one thing and lose sight of more important issues." I had to talk to Lisa about her obvious admiration for Paul, but I was angry, and this made it impossible for me to stop the problem in the first place. Lisa and I entered a spacious room closer to the center of the yacht. Calling it a cabin would be too simple. The space was probably about 800 square feet, with deep carpeting and elegant decor. It was a sunny day, and the floor-to-ceiling windows were set to the side, making it feel like we were standing on a luxurious terrace overlooking sparkling blue water and snow-white buildings in the distance. Paul was cunning. All alpha predators are like this. He could sense what I was about to do. So he came up to me, radiating friendliness, embraced me in a brotherly embrace, and took away to the side away from the press. He said, without a hint of apology, "That was great, Ryan. I want to fund your work for 3 years, say, 4 million. These words immediately pulled the rug out from under my feet. Paul may have stolen the moment, but with the money he just offered, I could do a lot to enhance my reputation. So I suppressed my ego and muttered, "That would be wonderful. And don't you dare judge me. People like Paul thrive because of the golden rule. Whoever has the gold rules." Paul realized he had bought me. Therefore, he switched to Lisa for the rest of the visit. This man knew absolutely no shame. However, it never even occurred to me that Paul could be a threat. Seriously, he had supermodels on call. What could Paul need from my nerdy girl, even if she had a world-class figure? The Archaeology Council called me a week later. I was standing knee-deep in a hot trench of ancient acrotiri, so the conversation with people from cold and rainy New Haven was a little disjointed. But the point was that they wanted me to come back immediately. Paul's money arrived, and I needed to sign the agreement. I thought, that was a little too fast. Lisa would remain in Akrotiri to continue directing the excavation while I boarded a local flight to Athens, where I had a direct flight to JFK. The local flight departed from Santorini Airport, which, oddly enough, is called International. The airport was at the top of the island, so Lisa drove me there early Monday morning. Western international flights always leave me exhausted. Sat in an airplane at 6 in the morning, spent 4 hours in Athens waiting for a connecting flight, then a 13-hour flight to New York, and still only 5 in the evening local time. So I stayed the night at the Fairfield Inn nearby from the airport. After 10 hours of sleep and a good breakfast, I got into my rental car and headed to New Haven. Our housekeeper was very surprised by my appearance crap. I forgot to warn her that I was coming, but she kindly returned to her dorm room, giving me the house for the duration of my visit. By that time, it was already late Tuesday evening. I planned to complete the paperwork with Paul's money on Wednesday and then take the flight back from JFK via Amsterdam to Schiphol. If everything had gone according to plan, I would have returned to Lisa no later than Friday afternoon. I was not surprised that I could not reach Lisa communications in the Cyclades often fail, and there it was just late at night. But the next morning, I started to worry when I couldn't contact her again. My concern grew when I arrived at Sheffield Hall to meet our grant supervisors and Paul's lawyer. But Paul himself was not there. I asked, "Where is our patron?" His lawyer replied, "Mr. Paul will not join us." I asked, "Where is he?" The lawyer, with cold indifference, replied, "He's on vacation. His presence is not required here." I took it for granted, but I got the belief that something happened to Lisa. So once all the paperwork was completed, I drove back to JFK and bought a ticket for the next overnight flight back. There were only central seats left in economy class, where it was cramped and uncomfortable. Seriously, I'd much rather row a galley chained to an oar, but the flight arrived a day early. Lisa was still unavailable. I took a taxi and drove the 7 miles from the airport to our apartment in Akrotiri. She wasn't there. Moreover, it seemed that she had not been there for some time. The students were at a dig site, so I hurried there to see if they knew anything about Lisa. Frank Lawrence, my best student and my assistant, supervised the work while the others carefully cleaned the frescoes in the lady's house. I said, irritably, "I'm looking for Lisa." He laughed sarcastically and said, "We too." She disappeared when this fat man in moccasins appeared, and everything fell into place. I turned out to be a gullible fool, but who could blame me? I always considered Lisa too intelligent to give in to such a base impulse as sex for the sake of instant gain. Seriously, how could I think otherwise? The rules of fidelity in marriage are clear, at least to normal people, and we both knew them very well. It never occurred to me that she would deliberately decide to break our marriage vows. Why is loyalty so important? Let's look at this pragmatically. Married people have different personalities, motivations, and life circumstances. Therefore, they need clear rules on the basis of which they can build a life together. These are the same vows about sickness and health, better and worse, that bind two different personalities into a single union. These vows involve exclusive consideration for each other. However, loyalty is the only aspect that can be easily assessed every day. That is why it is the main indicator of compliance with all other oaths. Reject all others is a clear rule. Loyalty either exists or it doesn't. This is an absolute concept. You cannot be almost true or true in your own way. Actions that violate the generally accepted rules of fidelity cross a line that cannot be crossed back. My inner voice and the feeling of being stabbed in the stomach told me that this line had already been crossed. I asked, in a voice in which my state was probably already visible. When was this? Lawrence, wiping sweat from his brow, replied, "On Monday morning." Then he added with slight irritation, "Tell your wife that abandoning people in the middle of a dig is not cool." Cool. I was going to show Lisa how cool it was. It's amazing how much smarter you become when you see how a trick works. It was a good old-fashioned bait and switch, and I was the simpleton. The grant money was a bait, and I fell for this scam headlong. Of course, who could blame me? I operated under the naive assumption that Paul and my wife were playing fair. However, I was now at DEFCON 1 level, focused on cold, merciless revenge. My first step was simple: go to Santorini to confirm my suspicions, and yes, Paul's yacht was still there. I returned fuming with anger. The plans were not complicated. Paul had the itch and Lisa had an exceptional body, so Paul took her on a 3-day trip, just for fun. Both sinners knew that happily ever after would not await them. None of them expected this. Lisa loved her life, but Paul had too many women and too little time. All they wanted was a moment out of time to indulge in a little dirty sex, nothing more. For Paul, it was an insatiable thirst for conquest and humiliation. This is a kind of dependence for any insecure man. Paul saw that poor, vulnerable Lisa was an easy target, so he turned on his charm and my wife gave in. It was inevitable. Confirming your sexual attractiveness is an important thing for a woman. Paul was a rock star. So what woman would not want to hang this trophy on her wall? I mean, the coolest guy in school chose my wife to mate with. The unremarkable Lisa, the girl with a big nose. This had never happened to her, and she was sure it would never happen again. So my wife jumped at the chance. And later, if she ever felt unattractive, she could remember being the temporary lover of a powerful man. As for me, I turned into a cold, ruthless bastard. The change happened so abruptly that it shocked me. I kind of loved this woman. Why did I suddenly become so heartless? Well, deliberate betrayal does exactly that to a man. I accepted the fact that our happy times were real and I treasured them. But the circumstances were different now. Our exclusive marital relationship had been sacrificed on the altar of personal selfishness, and I was ready to even the score. Lisa is smart, so I knew she had thought of it all. She'll get everything she can out of Paul, and when I come back on Friday, she'll be the same as she always was again. And she will drown out any residual guilt by dedicating the rest of her life to me. I was sure that Paul had convinced Lisa, or she had convinced herself, that a short affair in a long life of fidelity was harmless. But unfortunately for Lisa, deliberately betraying trust, especially for short-term gain, shows a complete lack of respect for the one she betrayed. The success of their plot depended on my not finding out anything. Paul created this opportunity by removing me from the picture. Sound heartless? Well, blind cruelty is the law of the jungle, and Paul's money was an antidote to responsibility. There was nothing I could do to him, physically or legally. And if it ruined my and Lisa's lives in the process, so what? We're nobody. If complete indifference is the opposite of true love, then I guess I still felt something for my soon-to-be ex-wife because I was furious. Even so, my anger was not motivated by any sentimental attachment to a woman willing to sell her marriage for sex with a walking idiot. It was caused by the loss of her lifelong companionship, and that's what hurt. At the same time, I wanted no. I needed tangible retribution, so I had to deal with two sinners face to face. If I wanted to look at myself in the mirror again, it was necessary. Accordingly, a clash had to be arranged. It would be unpleasant, but necessary. Surprise is the essence of a good ambush. I was going to catch Paul off guard the moment he walked through the door. There will be no physical violence. Sorting things out with fists is a pathetic, stupid decision worthy of those who are ready to spend 3 to 5 years in prison. Instead, I wanted Paul to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life. This is a gift that will delight again and again. However, this required leverage, so I spent the entire Thursday preparing the stage. Lisa and Paul showed up at 9 on Friday morning. I saw them coming because I was sitting on our balcony enjoying a cup of Greek coffee that was just brewed in our brickie. A Mercedes G-Class SUV was climbing up a narrow street. I knew it was Paul. Well, how many such expensive cars do you think there are on the island of Santorini? Paul came out from his side, walked around the car, and gallantly opened the door for Lisa, who came out in a new outfit. They exchanged a short kiss. Paul said something to her, and she giggled. Then she opened the outer door, and I heard footsteps on the stairs. The inner door opened, and the two of them entered the living room, still laughing at some joke. Paul beamed a smug smile and said with false sincerity, "I will never forget you." Lisa giggled again. Her laughter began to terribly irritate. Then I stepped into the living room from the balcony, finding them looking into each other's eyes with tenderness. Lisa was no doubt tired, sore, and completely content, believing she had time to reboot before I returned. "Surprise," I said sarcastically. "Welcome home, lovebirds." Their reaction made me laugh. If you've ever wondered what the expression "making bricks" looks like, here are two perfect examples in front of me. Lisa turned pale and collapsed on the sofa. Paul, as expected, tried to wriggle out. "You should be in New Haven signing the contract," he said reproachfully, as if I had broken some rule. "I was there, and I signed it," I said flippantly. Then he added, with a warning in his voice, "And now I'm here." I continued, sounding almost cheerful. "If you break even one of the terms of the agreement because of this little prank," I pointed at him and Lisa, "the Yale people will put this whole dirty story on the front page of the Times. I can already see the headline, 'Notorious Adulterer Breaks Deal.'" I added gloomily, "I know your wife doesn't care what you do as long as her support check comes on time. But even she will do something if you publicly humiliate her." I grinned and said, "I don't know how much half of your fortune is, but I'm sure it's much more than $4 million. Paul looked exactly like a cornered rat. I added firmly, "I have all the cards, so if I ever see or hear from you again, I will send this recording to every media outlet in the country." I pointed to the iPhone sitting on the kitchen counter, which was recording this entire pathetic spectacle, sincerely hoping that Paul would try to blackmail me. "I hope you understand that the commotion can be bloody," I said, shuddering dramatically. I finished. "I'm sure you're now trying to figure out how much it will take to bribe me. So, let me make it clear to you. Nothing will compensate for the destruction of my marriage. So just get the hell out of here." Then I turned theatrically to Lisa, who sat looking at me pleadingly. The floor didn't move. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Then I turned around, as if I expected to see that he had already left, and said with surprise, "Are you still here? You can go." I slightly pointed to the door with my fingers. I've always wanted to use this line from the Val Kilmer movie. Paul made a sound of disappointment, turned on his heel, and walked out of the apartment. I heard the Mercedes engine start, and the car drove off. Then I turned to Lisa. It was like I was about to drown a kitten. I am a practical person and intellectually self-possessed. I firmly believe that those who allow their emotions to control their actions, especially in stressful situations, are inevitably heading towards failure. So I sat down next to Lisa and asked in the most reasonable tone, "Why?" There were tears in Lisa's eyes, but she held on. She seemed to hope that she could explain herself, since I did not immediately call her a woman of easy virtue. But this did not happen. I was far beyond forgiveness and reconciliation. However, I wanted our marriage to end quietly, without scandals. Soft breakups are less traumatic and less costly in the long run. Lisa said desperately, "I'm so sorry. He assured me that you would never know." I replied sarcastically, "So how did it work for you?" Lisa sadly added, "I should never have listened to him. He pursued me relentlessly." This was news to me. I asked, surprised, "Let me get this straight. Was Paul stalking you? When did this start?" "We were almost always together from the moment we met him." Lisa sobbed and replied, "He started writing to me on WhatsApp. So now he is Peter." Lisa continued, "He sent me a message asking to meet as soon as we got off the ship. I agreed, thinking it had something to do with the new money. After that, he bombarded me with messages, even videos. At first, I deleted them. But he didn't back down, and I became curious." Lisa added with bitter regret, "You know that I have never been popular with guys, and then this influential man began to pursue me. This would turn the head of any woman." I asked dryly, "Have you ever thought about telling me about this?" Lisa blushed and admitted, "At first his attention embarrassed me. That's why I didn't mention it. I just wanted him to leave me alone. And then, when he didn't stop, I was afraid that you would think that I was provoking him. Then I agreed to meet him after you left for the States to convince him to stop. Obviously, it didn't work." Lisa added with obvious pain, "I know. I'm stupid. I put myself in a vulnerable position. I thought he was harmless." I replied sarcastically, "Obviously, this is not the case." Lisa winced and said, "In general, I allowed him to take me to his yacht. He said that it would be more convenient to talk there." "Really?" I frowned theatrically. Lisa shrugged and admitted, "I'm an ordinary woman, and this man is a real force of nature, especially when he wants something. I knew that you would never understand." She added in a pleading tone, "He said he wanted a short affair while you were away." I tried to object, but he found answers to all my arguments. His persistence was flattering. He was charming, witty, and very attentive. He made me feel special, and damn, everything he said started to make sense to me. Boring, the usual excuses. Lisa paused for a minute to collect her thoughts. Then she said bitterly, "I was on his yacht all day, and by that time I felt comfortable. We were sitting on the couch, drinking wine and watching the sunset, when he suddenly grabbed me and kissed me. I resisted, but the longer he held me, the better it seemed." She stopped, looked at me with regret, and said, "That's when I fell." "I'm tired of this," I snorted and said, "Fell? People fall by accident. This is not intentional. Let's call a spade a spade. You deliberately spent 4 nights and 3 days having sex with that idiot. This was not an accident, it was a deliberate betrayal. I knew that my smart wife could not be so naive unless she wanted to be." The truth broke Lisa. She covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. "I never thought you would find out. I wanted to do this just once, just for myself. It was just 3 days in a life full of love and devotion that I wanted to give you." This whole scene with the angry husband and the remorseful wife had become so commonplace that it was already embarrassing. I said calmly, almost indifferently, "You play, you pay, and the price for this is our happy future together, because I don't see any scenario in which I could continue this marriage." Lisa screamed. No, she threw herself on my chest, hugging me as if I were the last floating door on the sinking Titanic. I let her cry on me for an awkwardly long time. Then she raised her tear-stained face, hoping for a kiss. If I had given in to this impulse, I would have been condemned forever. But, as I said, I have a fairly strong character, and I knew that the only acceptable outcome was separation. Let me add here that my decision was not dictated only by offended feelings, although there were plenty of them too. However, in such situations, emotions do not matter. My wife intentionally betrayed me, and I wasn't desperate enough to take a chance and hope that this very bad, terrible, disgusting act of hers wouldn't happen again. So, in the immortal words of the great American philosopher John Wayne, a man has to do what he has to do. I looked at Lisa's exhausted face, reminiscent of a mask of tragedy, and said, I love you with all my heart. But this wound is forever, and I will never be able to forget it. It will always be there, growing and festering until it kills us both. We're both young, so we need to do it now. Thus ended the era of innocence. It was a binary choice, leave or stay. The easy option would be to simply forgive and forget. Life would continue as if nothing had happened. But the immutable principles of life came into play, and a person cannot call himself decent if his response to outright betrayal is to pretend that nothing happened. I didn't love Lisa that much. To deceive me once is shameful. To deceive twice is a shame to me. So, to be honest, the solution was simpler than I expected. I put my soon-to-be ex-wife on a plane to New Haven. She begged and cried, and I was polite but firm. Realistically, a happy life doesn't shine if one of you has crossed the line. Yes, some couples experience this, especially if they have children. But our situation with Lisa was clear, so it's time to move on. After that, my life continued to take its course. A year later, I literally struck gold and became a very rich man. Over the next few years, I had fun shorting Paul's investment portfolio. It was a great way to remind him that I'm still around. I didn't have enough capital to bankrupt this bastard, but every success in trading was a nice little thing. And my manipulations almost doubled my personal fortune. I also sent a recording of our final conversation to the media. What? Did you think I would keep my promise to that scoundrel? The divorce cost Paul a fortune, but he still had enough money to pay for plastic surgery for Lisa. They seemed to have shrunk her nose by a good centimeter. I've seen pictures of them at events. Lisa looked great, but they both seemed unhappy. Schadenfreude, maybe, but it still hurts. As for me, I became a sea tramp. Living on a luxury sailing yacht is an ideal option for a single man. A high-class sailing yacht is a great place for a single man to live. 40 feet is the maximum safe size for solo sailing on the open ocean, at least unless you were born with a helm in your hands. Therefore, Beneteau was the ideal choice. The yacht was equipped with advanced electronics, autopilot, high-speed internet, and every possible convenience, including a full kitchen, satellite TV, and real teak bulkheads. I now pursued archaeology as a hobby rather than as a job. This meant that I researched what piqued my interest. Typically, an archaeologist must formulate the purpose of the study before starting an excavation. That is why I decided to explore the legendary Sacred Lake. It is located on the island of Delos, near Mykonos. Delos is a huge reserve of antiquities. There are no permanent residents on the island and very few tourists. It has been an important part of Greek mythology since time immemorial. Delos was so sacred that the Athenians forbade locals from dying or giving birth on the island. To reinforce this prohibition, they dug up everyone who was buried on Delos and transferred their bodies to the neighboring island of Rhynia. If Delos was a sacred land, then the sacred lake was its most sacred place. According to legend, it was in this lake that Leto gave birth to twins Artemis and Apollo. Zeus seduced Leto, which led to the furious jealousy of his wife Hera. Naturally, Hera blamed another woman, not her vile husband, and forbade Leto to give birth on land. Therefore, Leto had to give birth to children in the waters of the sacred lake. Now it is no longer a lake. The Greeks drained it 100 years ago because it became a breeding ground for malaria mosquitoes. But I speculated that, due to its religious significance, significant artifacts may have remained in its drained bottom. Naturally, I had to butter up a lot of officials to get permission to excavate, which took a lot of time. That's why I was sitting on the luxurious aft deck of my yacht Argo, smoking an expensive cigar and planning tomorrow's work. The next day, I was sweating profusely as I dug a shallow trench in the undergrowth within the lake's original boundaries. And then I heard a woman's voice full of indignation. "What are you doing here?" I raised my head and almost dropped the shovel. A goddess stood before me, but not the kind covered by an ancient Greek table. This one was wearing tight yoga leggings and an expensive sports jacket that wouldn't look out of place in Beverly Hills. However, the recurve bow slung over her shoulder hinted that she was no ordinary tourist. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but this woman's face, with its perfect heart shape, seemed perfect, both in proportion and in the smallest details. Long eyelashes, huge blue eyes, ruby lips, and skin like rose petals. Her golden hair was styled in a stylish, airy updo that clearly emphasized her sportiness. Her body only confirmed this impression. She was built for speed strong, with elastic thighs, like a large hunting cat. Her long, slender yet powerful legs ended in a pair of women's Prada hiking boots Brixton, which probably cost at least $1,500. I would send any nosy bitch away, but not if there is a goddess standing in front of me. This woman deserved my full attention. My God, just talking to her felt like I was entering territory where I wasn't supposed to be. However, there was something else about her, something inexplicably attractive. I climbed out of the trench, hastily wiped my hands on my pants, and extended my hand for a handshake. "My name is Ryan," I said. "I am an archaeologist and study Greek religious practices of the classical era." She looked interested, so I added, "I am trying to document the types and patterns of Hellenic worship here on Delos." Then, perhaps too pedantically, he added, "You probably don't know this, but this place is the birthplace of some of the major figures of the Greek pantheon." The goddess looked at my dirty hand with obvious disgust, leaving hers to herself, and answered, "Oh, I know about the lake." Something in her intonation seemed strange to me. Then she hesitated slightly and added, more easily, "Where are my manners? Call me Misty. I am from Ephesus, but I was born here." This was even more interesting. "This is a curious coincidence," I noted, "because the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world, is located in Ephesus, and this place is considered the birthplace of Artemis." I added with a joking intonation, "Are you by any chance a Greek goddess?" The woman gave me a surprised look and then laughed sharply. Her expression was a mixture of irritation and interest, and something incomprehensible. She asked, "Why do you know the pantheon so well?" I shrugged. "Why is someone interested in this or that?" Since childhood, I was fascinated by Greek mythology, and I made it my profession. I could dig on Olympus, but Apollo and his sister Artemis have always interested me the most. Apollo was like a movie star, and Artemis was the ideal feminist, her natural beauty hunting. To my surprise, the woman continued to listen. For me, it was a real miracle. Usually such dazzling beauties found a reason to leave as soon as it became clear that they were talking to an archaeologist botanist. To continue the conversation, I asked, "Why are you here?" I nodded towards the bow slung over her shoulder and added, "Hunting is prohibited on the island." Misty looked at me strangely again and replied, "I like nature, and I always carry a bow with me in case I run into trouble." She added gloomily, "And I know how to use it." I laughed. "I have no doubt. But I mean, why are you on Delos now?" Then a thought came to me. And where do you actually live? After all, Ephesus has been abandoned for 600 years. I know I worked there. For a moment, it even occurred to me, perhaps my excavations in the dry lake have attracted the attention of Artemis herself. Absurd, of course. The goddess looked embarrassed, as if I had caught her in lies. She gave me another mysterious look and said, "I didn't say that I live in Ephesus. I said I was from there. I currently live with my half-brother Dion in Naxos. My twin brother Sonny is there too." It still didn't explain the difference of 600 years, but I wasn't that I blew it to dig further. "Oh," was all I could say. And he added, even more intrigued, "How did you get here?" Misty's face turned slightly red, and she admitted, "My Uncle Don threw me off the yacht." This man is hot-tempered. She hesitated and added, but me too. She continued with irritation. Uncle Don is a shipping magnate. He practically controls trade in the Aegean Sea, and he believes that he can do whatever he wants. We had a little quarrel about this, so he left me here. I enthusiastically suggested, I can take you back to Mykonos if you want. I'm done for today. That wasn't true, but the opportunity to spend more time with this beauty was worth ending early. Seriously, guys like me never hang out with women. Her level never. Misty looked at me thoughtfully and asked, could you take me to Naxos? It was 70 miles away. About 8 hours sailing. It was already approaching dinner, and I avoided night sailing unless it was absolutely necessary. So I answered, I can take you tomorrow. Do you have somewhere to stay overnight in Mykonos? She looked at me with her signature piercing gaze and asked, can your boat accommodate 2 people? What? Did this woman just offer to spend the night on my boat? Just imagine. I was averagely wealthy and mildly attractive, but I was clearly out of her league. She read my reaction and said, don't worry. I took a vow of chastity. I won't seduce you, he, in my dreams. She was the most desirable woman I had ever met, and she had just announced that she had committed herself to a life of virginity. Seriously, this could only happen to me. Perhaps her innocence was due to her orientation, but I got the impression that the reason was spiritual, something like a monastic vow. However, spending time with this goddess was a reward in itself, like admiring a Monet painting. I agreed. Certainly. The next morning I made coffee while making pancakes for breakfast. I slept on the pull-out couch in the cabin, and Misty spent the night in a high-tech sleeping pod I installed in the bow of the boat with the bulkhead door locked, of course. Most people would look rumpled after a night in an unfamiliar place, but Misty was completely collected. She was wearing one of my shirts, her graceful long legs peeking out from under the hem. It seemed like she was wearing nothing else except her shirt. But one guy has already been torn to pieces by his own hunting dogs for seeing Artemis naked, so I tried not to look too closely. Good morning, I said cheerfully, removing the frying pan and placing the pancake on the stack. Misty bowed her head slightly in gratitude and said with a smile, what attention. Do you remember that I took a vow of chastity? I replied, of course, it's sad, but we still have to eat. She gave me a beaming smile. We left the port under the wonderful Aegean sun. Having rounded the islet of Vrahonicida Cavuranisi, I raised the sails and pointed the boat to the south-southeast. My incredibly dexterous companion helped manage the hoisting lines of the sails, running along the slippery deck like a squirrel on a tree. This woman was amazingly athletic. The sail filled with wind, and the look of delight on Misty's beautiful face was simply priceless. Then she sat down next to me under the visor, while the autopilot kept us on a heading of 178 degrees. To pass the time, we talked about our lives. I told her about my archaeological work, keeping silent about the crown of Leonidas. No one needed to know about it. But I spoke in detail about the divorce. I've never discussed how Lisa's betrayal affected me before, partly because I had no friends, and only those who are willing to pay to talk about themselves go to psychotherapists. However, sharing my story has been strangely cathartic. It was as if the curtain of hopelessness that was preventing me from seeing the future suddenly parted, and a golden path opened before me, almost like divine intervention. I told Misty that the main reason Lisa and I broke up was her secret intrigue. Perhaps I could have survived betrayal if it had been a spontaneous act, committed on impulse and immediately regretted it. But Lisa was guided by a primitive desire to be conquered by a strong man who only sought to demonstrate his superiority. Misty remarked thoughtfully, my father is like that. He takes what he wants. She was especially interested in my stories about Akrotiri. English was clearly not the native language of my beautiful companion. Sometimes she mixed up the times. For example, when I was talking about the volcano, she said, I knew about the volcano in Tyre. It's strange because she should have said, I know, in the present tense. Her use of the past tense made it sound like she was there when the volcano erupted, which was quite unusual. So, you will live in Naxos with your brothers. How did this happen? I asked. Misty put on that look that everyone gets when they talk about the black sheep in the family and said, Dion is not my brother, but my half-brother. She winced and added, same father, different mothers. Our father is a real old goat. She continued, Dion ran the most popular club on the island. Then his wife Ariadne decided to die. Misty fell silent and then added, I would do the same too if my husband ran after other women like Dion did after Ariadne. She touched her bow and added gloomily, or maybe it would be better to kill him. Misty revealed that Ariadne's death sent Dion into one of his manic depressive episodes, and he began drinking. The club was on the verge of closing, and then the family intervened. All 12 decided that she and her brother Sonny should take control. Sonny and I are twins, she said. That's why we agreed to help. Uncle Don offered to take me to Naxos on his yacht. She winced again. Don is my father's brother. I should have known better. He's a dirty old man just like my father. Misty fell silent, as if remembering what had happened. Then she added, Fortunately, he just left me on the island, because one of us would have ended up dead if he kept getting his way. Well, now everything has become clear. Misty came from a large Greek family with strong emotions. The Cyclades is known for its club scene, especially during the tourist season. These clubs are usually located on the waterfront of the island's main town, which in Naxos is called either Naxos Town or Kora, depending on who you talk to. I didn't know which club belonged to Misty's family, but some of the more peculiar places were famous for their sex parties reminiscent of ancient myths. I know this because I visited such clubs after my divorce. I may have even encountered her half-brother Dion back in the day. I was reminded of one guy who didn't seem to realize that dressing up like Sonny Crockett made him look like a loser from the 80s. He led a group of fans who got crazy drunk, after which live sex shows began in booths, on tables, or even right on the dance floor. I could imagine how a composed woman like Misty could be humiliated by such behavior, especially when it came to a member of her family. Sailors approaching Naxos from the north round a strange cape, which resembles a small island connected to the main island by a causeway. The ruins of the Temple of Apollo are located on this island. These ruins are hard to miss because the Portara 220-foot columns with a carved architrave stand out against the skyline. It's like a giant door welcoming you as you sail along the breakwater that forms the harbor, hence the name. The marinas are protected by another breakwater, which runs along a large part of the promenade of the old town of Kora. I docked and connected the sanitation and power systems while Misty watched from the cockpit. Then I returned to the boat, jumped over the railing, and said, Can I help you ashore, my lady? I had kept my promise by delivering her, so I assumed she would now mind her own business. However, she stopped, biting her lip, as if thinking about something. Finally, she asked, Do you need to urgently return to the excavations, or do you have some time? I would like to introduce you to my family. What? Let's review all the circumstances. Here was the most beautiful woman I had ever known, at least in real life, and she was interested in friendship, if not anything more. I could live with that. Naturally, I replied. Drive. We caught a taxi on the embankment. It was an old diesel Mercedes with perhaps 500,000 miles on it. This car was clearly destined for imminent execution by environmentally conscious activists due to its plumes of blue smoke, but it nevertheless managed the 6-mile climb into the mountains without any problems. Misty's modest house turned out to be worth perhaps 40 million, if not more. It sat on top of a ridge with stunning views of the Aegean Sea and the neighboring island of Paros in the distance. Instead of a single building, it was a complex of luxurious structures reminiscent of a Roman villa, with all the amenities you would expect from upscale housing in the Cyclades. Misty told the driver to leave us at the highest villa on the ridge. This house was probably about 4,000 square feet, built of marble, brick, and whitewashed walls, and had an infinity pool. Behind him stretched the greenest nature on the island. Misty commented while I was paying the taxi driver. I used to hunt a lot in these places. There are paths here that only I know about. Misty was truly an amazing woman. If the gods carved a statue of female beauty, it would look exactly like Misty. But her beauty was not seductive, but pure like an alpine meadow and not a hot tropical beach. The words freshness, health, and energy came to mind. Instead of sex appeal, Misty exuded confidence, strength, and absolute competence. If there was a task to be completed, Misty was the person to trust with a task. Perhaps that is why the family was the first to turn to her when they needed to save the club. Misty told me that her brother Sonny would host the club and she would handle everything that went on behind the scenes. She explained this as she rummaged through her wardrobe, trying to find the right outfit. I heard a muffled voice from her bedroom. "I need to go in there for a minute, just to let you know I've arrived." She was probably looking for something in the closet. Then she added, "Do you want to go to the club with me? Or stay here, take whatever you want. I have people who make sure the refrigerator is full." I was about to answer when Misty appeared at the door in the outfit she had chosen for a quick look at the club. Imagine Jessica Rabbit if she was created as the ideal female athlete. She was wearing one of those short, sparkly dresses that end 4 inches from her hips. How women manage not to show everything in such outfits is a mystery to all men. I froze with my mouth open. The perfection of Misty's long, sculpted legs and the grace of her tan body turned me to stone, and in one place in particular. I swallowed and said, "I'll go with you." We walked down the steps into an immaculate garage full of tools. Misty, as if by chance, remarked, "I repair cars." The car in this case was a sedan. This would be an uncharacteristic choice for a woman like Misty, if it weren't for the fact that it was Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio with 500 horsepower and, of course, in the legendary Italian racing red color. Misty revved up the Ferrari's twin turbocharged V6 engine, and its high, menacing whine at idle sounded truly impressive. Naturally, the Alpha Misty came with a 6-speed gearbox. She backed up slowly, released the clutch, and we raced down the winding road like Formula One competitors. The only thing that kept me from going crazy with fear was the belief that Misty's vision and reflexes were not ordinary, but perhaps superhuman. She clearly took extreme driving courses. It was like driving around the Monte Carlo circuit with Danica Patrick. Misty was a true goddess behind the wheel. The Misty Family Club was located not far from where my boat was moored in the Naxos marina. During the day, the building looked quite harmless under the bright Aegean sun. But as darkness fell and the party began, it turned into something more reminiscent of the ninth circle of hell from Divine Comedy by Dante, a place where adulterers gather. There was a patio outside where people sat and ate. Inside, the club was decorated like a regular restaurant. It was now dinner time, and the diners were enjoying the delicious dishes. We walked through a large room at the back of the building that was empty. Apparently, it was a dance space with a DJ booth that looked like it was borrowed from the bridge of the Starship Enterprise and 15-foot speakers. Misty opened the door without knocking, and we walked into an office that wouldn't have looked out of place at Microsoft or Northrop Grumman headquarters. In the center of the room stood a piano, behind which sat the only occupant of the office. He lazily played a melody that sounded so mesmerizing that I immediately realized that I had never heard it before, so he composed it himself. The man himself was the embodiment of the ideal man. The beauty of the human body has a mathematical expression. These are ideal proportions, facial features, and physical build, close to the standard of geometric harmony. This man was the embodiment of such an ideal, just like his sister. Every aspect of their appearance was flawlessly symmetrical. He had the same golden blonde hair as Misty, styled into a shiny, neat cap. His facial features could be called noble: piercing blue eyes, a confident chin. His physique was perfect, not too tall, not too muscular, just perfect. He moved with the grace of a professional dancer. Plus, he was incredibly charming. The man stood up and crossed the room with grace, turning to me with a friendly smile. "You must be Ryan. Misty told me about you. The discovery of the crown of Leonidas is very impressive." Holy saints, I was stunned. The man gave me an almost unearthly smile and added, "Don't worry, we've all made worse mistakes." Stunned, I finally squeezed out, "How do you know about the crown?" He answered with a mysterious smile, "Oh, we know a lot." I began to suspect that these were clearly not ordinary people in front of me, and this thought was finally cemented when the third member of their family entered the room. The third member of the family entered the room with an air that could be described as regal, but at the same time frighteningly arrogant. This was Dion's half-brother. It was immediately clear that Dion was clearly not one of their kind. Short and dark-haired, with long curls and a thick beard, he wore a rumpled and stained Olympiakos tracksuit with the top open to reveal his hairy chest, hung with gold chains. In his hand, he held a bottle of Greek red wine by the neck. Yes, it was the same guy from the club. Dion looked younger than the twins, but his face betrayed the vices of an inveterate reveler. He was completely drunk. Staggering, he entered the room and collapsed onto the chair at the table, almost flying out of it when he tried to sit down. Sonny said with contempt in his voice, "It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're already drunk." Dion cast a dull, slightly irritated glance at his half-brother and muttered, "I haven't gone to bed yet. My friends and I hung out all night at a Lucy's." Then he finally noticed me and, slightly slurring his tongue, asked, "Who is this, mortal?" "Mortal." Sonny ignored this curious question and explained with an arrogant note in his voice, "This is Misty's new companion. He will help us here at the club." "I?" Then Sonny turned to me and said something completely strange. "You want to know how everything works, right?" I froze, lost in my thoughts. It's not that I'm that stupid, but as strange as it may sound, there was something suspiciously familiar about Misty, Sonny, and Dion. Each of them had distinct features that were impossible to ignore. My goal was to study the divine twins. Excavations of the lake where they are believed to have been born could provide answers. But living next to them is a whole other level of exploration. So why not let things take their course? Plus, I happen to be the companion of the most beautiful woman I've ever met. True, it was not as rosy as it might seem. After all, if Misty is who I thought she was, then in her history there were men who tried to approach her and ended badly. Bufagos, shot, Actaeon, is torn to pieces by his own dogs. Caledon, turned to stone, Brodias, burned alive. You see where I'm going with this. So, I knew from the very beginning that there would be no intrigue in this adventure. But damn, can you resist the opportunity to spend time with a real member of the Greek pantheon? This is a chance to learn so many new things. So I answered enthusiastically, almost without thinking, "I want to stay with you as long as you accept me." Misty's face lit up with joy. I looked at her and added, "I understand the rules and accept them." Thus began a new round in the chaotic history of my life. In just 3 years, I went from a relatively inexperienced archaeological enthusiast to a first-class artifact hunter, and now I was to live side by side with one of the key figures of the Greek pantheon, and naturally, I would be declared crazy if I shared my suspicions with anyone. However, Misty was a wonderful companion and even a best friend. Because of her little problem with cleanliness and chastity, I had my own separate apartments. But we spent the rest of the time together, eating and chatting in the common area of this marble splendor. If conversations with Lisa were interesting, then discussing ideas with the goddess is completely beyond the bounds. Sonny wasn't kidding when he said he would find me a job. The club was open from dinner until 4 in the morning, and the activity there did not stop. Dinner was served until 10, and the rest of the time the drinks were served to the throngs of revelers. My job was to make sure the drinks flowed freely. This is what brought profit to the 3 partners. We had 6 waitresses: Anticlea, Procris, Siren, Philomena, Atlanta, and Callisto. They were all stunning. Anticlea, Procris, and Atlas were of the Mediterranean type, dark and seductive. Siren and Philonoma were energetic blondes, somewhat similar to Misty. But Callisto was special, perhaps even more special than their owner. Callisto had a beautiful oval face with huge green eyes, skin like white satin, and long copper hair that framed all this splendor. Her body was perfect. She had simply incredible shapes that attracted everyone's attention. Callisto had that something that set her apart from the rest. Her attractiveness was a combination of long legs and incredibly graceful, almost perfect curves. When Callisto walked by in her 4-inch stilettos, the old Greek men grabbed their private parts and made obscene whistling noises. Each waitress wore tight-fitting Lululemon leggings that covered almost nothing, paired with crop tops that looked more like sports bras. A strip of toned, tan belly was visible between her leggings and top. In such outfits, the girls earned serious tips. Atlanta and Anticlea were especially lush. Procris, Siren, and Philanoma had slender, fit figures. Callisto was in the middle like in the Goldilocks fairy tale, not too much, not too little, but just right. I had a great relationship with each of the girls. Perhaps it was because I lived with their boss, but I treated everyone the same, which ensured their favor. These women worked from 10 at night to 4 in the morning, 6 days a week, and I respected their work. Each of them had a strong character. It's understandable to work in a place like our club, you need firmness. I instituted a no-touching rule, enforced by 3 Amazons that Sunny had obtained from somewhere. Although they were women, no one dared to mess with them. All 3 were over 6 feet tall and skilled in wrestling techniques. Misty left the management of the waitresses to me, but she handled discipline issues personally, so I wasn't surprised when she called Callisto into her office before her shift started. But I was stunned when she slammed the door in my face when I tried to follow her in. It was something new, so I stayed nearby, trying to understand what was happening. What I heard was a real epic fight. I couldn't make out what they were talking about, but it was obvious that Misty was trying to tear off a piece from Callisto, and she answered her no less harshly. I was about to put my ear to the door when it suddenly burst open and Callisto stormed out of the office, covering her face with her hands and sobbing. Misty shouted from behind, "And don't let me see you here again, little woman of easy virtue." I waited a second to make sure that no objects would fly after me and entered the office. Misty sat at the table, her eyes sparkling furiously. I tried to speak as calmly as possible. "What happened, boss?" Misty looked up, and at that moment I saw for the first time the face of Homer's angry goddess. The woman sitting at the table was not the calm, slightly sarcastic friend I knew. It was a terrifying being, infinitely powerful, angry, and threatening. Artemis's role in the pantheon was to embody nature in all its changeable states, from the bright sun to wild destruction. Like nature, her moods were fickle, and it was clear that a perfect storm was raging in her office. I didn't want to face her rage, so I said, "Sorry for the intrusion, boss. I'd better leave so you can deal with what's troubling you." Her face cleared up, as if the sun had come out after a hurricane. She hurriedly said, "No, wait. I really need to talk to you. Close the door and sit down." I sat down. Misty was still fuming. She gave me a thoughtful look and said, "You must have guessed who I am a long time ago." I replied, "Yes, I guessed it. But that makes you 4 or 5,000 years old, and you look no older than 25. Her silvery laugh made it clear that she understood the joke. "Misty, I just couldn't call her by her real name," continued. "As you probably already understood, none of the pantheon originated on Earth. We are from much more ancient planets. We have technologies that allow us to maintain the form in which we want to live." I was surprisingly not shocked. "So, you are all from a distant star." My beautiful interlocutor answered with a smile. "Stars. There are an infinite number of developed societies in space, and some of them have chosen this solar system for life. My family is one of them." It was easy to believe. As the writer and scientist Arthur C. Clarke said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Therefore, the inhabitants of the ancient Earth probably rightly considered such aliens to be gods. Misty continued, "But each of us has the same weaknesses and vices as the human inhabitants of this place." I understood this too. The ancient gods always seemed to me more human than the exalted deities who appeared later. After all, there is not a single pantheon of pre-Christian gods, neither Greek nor Roman, nor even Scandinavian, that would not demonstrate all human weaknesses, from lust to jealousy, from greed to debauchery. These gods were very real and easy to identify with. Later, more monotheistic deities seemed more like dreams of something unattainable. Misty said, "Someone had to stand up for personal dignity." Obviously, she was not talking about human society, but about her family. Therefore, I dedicated myself and my mortal companions to purity and virtue. She made a sweeping gesture, pointing to the entire club, and continued, "Each of the 6 girls on our staff is a member of my inner circle, and they are all innocent. They must remain that way to be part of my environment." Misty's eyes shone with a divine light again as she added, "Most of my anger is directed at my father." She was referring to the creature that classical mythology calls Zeus. "My father has endless power, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, and he's the horniest bastard on the planet. When he sees any woman he likes, he just has to get her. He tricked Callisto into believing that I was the one in bed with her. Now she's pregnant, and I have to get rid of her. Wow, given what happened to those who offended the gods in the classical period, it was not clear to me what was meant by get rid of. So I asked, is this something serious? You're not going to turn her into a bay tree or something, are you?" Misty laughed out loud, becoming the friend I knew again. "We don't do that anymore. In fact, half of what we are told in mythology never happened. So maybe I'll just turn Callisto into a deer." She made a gesture as if she was shooting with a bow. Seeing the horror on my face, she added with a laugh, "Kidding," I said. "No, seriously, what will happen to Callisto now?" Misty answered lightly, as if it was no big deal. "Normally Sonny would have taken her under his wing. He always has 1 or 2 mistresses on the side. But Coronus will kill him if he has an affair with Callisto. She's too beautiful, and if Dion tries to do something, I will personally intervene. My stepbrother destroys women." She thought for a second, and then said, as if it had dawned on her, "Hey, why don't you take care of her? You are also a mortal, and you have a separate home. I will be much calmer if she is with you. Moreover, I will give Callisto her job back if you accept her. So, let's figure it out." My best friend and companion offered me shelter to an incredibly beautiful woman who could compete in beauty with the goddesses themselves. What could go wrong? Of course, I knew nothing about Callisto, except that she was the friendliest and simplest of all Artemis's circle. But on the other hand, Callisto may have had her own thoughts about who would live with her. They said that she was excellent with a bow. The main problem, besides the obvious one, was that Misty seemed to be offering me some sort of semi-permanent relationship with Callisto. This would be wonderful if not for the fact that Callisto was expecting a child from Zeus, and I knew nothing about how to raise demigods. Plus, caring for Callisto and her child meant that I would have to give up my carefree life as a sea tramp. I wasn't sure how well Misty could read my mind, but she said in the voice of a goddess, "This is not a proposal, Ryan. I want you to do this for me to please me." Not fulfilling the request of such a powerful and, frankly, dangerous being as Artemis was not the best idea. Men who refused her usually turned into trees, human-sized rocks, or, in one notable case, a woman. I said, "So what should I do, boss?" The goddess looked at me as if she didn't believe that I could be so stupid, and answered as if talking to an idiot. "Find Callisto and tell her what we decided. Tell her that she will live with you and can keep her job. Moreover, I will move completely, leaving you the entire house. I want to spend more time hunting." I wasn't stupid enough to tell a powerful and obviously dangerous being like Artemis that I needed time to think. Therefore, as soon as I left her office, I immediately went to look for Callisto. I found her, pathetic, curled up in a ball in a dark and empty part of the club. She cried as if her heart was breaking. It was a pitiful sight. I sat down in the booth next to her and put my arm around her shoulders, trying to comfort her. Callisto was a small woman only about 5 feet 3 inches and weighed perhaps 115 pounds. She clung to me, resting her head on my chest, still sobbing. I said, Misty told me about your situation. I know you are scared and confused. So let me explain what we offer. Maybe this will make you feel a little better. Callisto raised her head and looked at me with tear-stained eyes. Even in this state, she was magnificent. An oval face, huge green eyes, perfect cheekbones with a scattering of freckles, a wide, sensual mouth with graceful lips, and a thick head of copper hair. I continued softly. You know who Misty really is, right? Callisto nodded cautiously. She understands that her father is the real culprit, and she feels sorry for you. But you're pregnant, so you can't be part of her circle anymore. You need at least temporary shelter, so she asked me to help, and I will gladly do it. Callisto looked at me in amazement, as if I had appeared on a white horse in shining armor. I continued. Misty gave us her apartment in the complex and will allow you to continue working at the club. We can decide how we will live so that you feel comfortable. Her eyes, like emeralds, carefully studied me as if trying to understand what was wrong. I looked at her with sincerity, trying to instill confidence in her. Finally, she said in her warm and melodious voice, I will accept your offer because I have no other choice. But I'm your neighbor, not your girlfriend. I laughed. What a character. I extended my little finger to her for the oath and said, Welcome, neighbor. The next few months were quite interesting. Unlike most Cyclades islands, Naxos is densely covered with forests and mountains. Therefore, Artemis completely disappeared into the impenetrable wilderness in the center of the island. I got the impression that only there she felt happy. Unfortunately, she took all her huntresses with her, that is, our entire staff of waitresses except Callisto. Poor Callisto had to hire, train, and manage 5 new girls. Misty's disappearance also left me in charge of the club. It seems that this was their original plan. The gods have little interest in the entertainment of tourists, but to appoint me, a person completely unsuitable in character and experience, to manage a nightclub, even worse, besides the fact that I was an archaeologist and not a socialite, Misty's absence left me alone with her brothers. Sonny didn't create any problems. He was his usual charming self, but his interests focused on art, music, and dance. He was absolutely useless in running the club. Although he got along great with clients, every evening he played the piano and communicated on the dance floor, like a king among his retinue. Visitors simply adored him. However, this was not surprising, considering who he really was. It's better to say less about Dion. His behavior had always been the epitome of debauchery, but the loss of his wife Ariadne brought self-destructiveness into his appearance, and his company was a separate nightmare. His entourage consisted of spoiled, lustful friends. The Amazons regularly threw them into the alley behind the club, where even the rats avoided them. And yet, despite the chaos, my life with Callisto was unexpectedly pleasant. She was always simpler and friendlier than other beauties, with a certain boyish simplicity that did not at all match her striking appearance. Her approach to life was explained by her origins. Other girls were the daughters of wealthy businessmen from large cities, such as Athens, Patras, and Thessaloniki. Callisto grew up on a farm in Arcadia, near Lacedaemon, the traditional home of the Spartans. Outwardly, Callisto blended in with the other girls while working thanks to the same makeup and uniform. But at home, she wore simple clothes, jeans, shorts, and t-shirts, without any makeup. Even without it, she remained incredible. Her striking appearance combined long copper hair, emerald eyes, perfect porcelain skin, and a scattering of freckles. One day, on a beautiful evening in the Aegean Sea, I finally plucked up the courage to ask Callisto how she became part of Artemis' entourage. We sat on the marble terrace, enjoying excellent Greek red wine and watching the sunset over distant Paros. Callisto laughed and said, It happened by accident. My family has a farm near Tripoli in the Peloponnese. We were disturbed by a bear that came down from the Mantinia Plateau, so I went hunting. The idea of such a rare beauty as Callisto hunting a bear seemed difficult to imagine, but I motioned for her to continue. She said, The bear and I met on a forest road, and he immediately attacked. So I stood there, shooting arrows at him over and over again. This was my Callisto, tenacious and skilled with a bow. The contrast between her strength and courage and her extreme femininity was one of the things that made her so incredibly attractive. Callisto paused and added, as if she expected me to understand. That's when I saw the goddess. Artemis witnessed my confrontation with the bear and called me along. My family has always followed the old religion, so I knew they would accept it. This raised an interesting question. Callisto looked to be in her late 20s, which was exactly the same age as Artemis looked. However, according to mythology, the goddess was at least 5,000 years old. So the obvious question was, how old is Callisto? Really? I asked. Are you still mortal, or has being with Artemis changed you? Her laugh was like a warm fire on a cold night as she said, I'm 29 years old, about 3 years younger than you look, if you're mortal too. I smiled at her and said, well, at least we have something in common. Callisto said, okay, I told you my story. What brings you here? Then I told her my sad story without hiding anything. It was the first time I really opened up, at least to another mortal, about the grief I was going through. And it turned out to be liberating because it gave me the context I needed to understand that we all have weaknesses. Effective people cope with adversity by developing a rational understanding of the situation and acting based on facts rather than constructing convenient fantasies. Talking to Callisto helped me let go of all the false illusions about my role in the end of our marriage, and for the first time I accepted that divorce was the only realistic option. My wife was a woman with high sexual desire and poor self-esteem, so putting the right amount of pressure on her weak points would inevitably lead to what happened. This was the most convincing reason to break up with Lisa, because those weaknesses will always be there and available for exploitation by the next arrogant jerk with a good speech. Same with Callisto. In the case of both Lisa and Callisto, their lives would have turned out very differently if they had not attracted an immoral man. I mean, Paul took advantage of Lisa's insecurities about her appearance, just as Zeus took advantage of Callisto's devotion to Artemis. However, the main reason was Callisto's love for Artemis. This gave Zeus a path to her bed. This does not absolve either woman from the consequences, there is no going back from them. However, it illustrates how inhumanely exploitative human behavior can be. When I finished explaining to Callisto why I didn't blame her for her current situation, I got a strange reaction from her. Instead of the expected relief, I saw disappointment and then anger. She carefully placed the glass of wine on the coffee table, stood up, and silently went to her bedroom, loudly slamming the door. For any man, the map of a woman's mind has large blank areas labeled, "Here are the dragons live here." So, like every other ignorant member of my subspecies, I walked up and knocked on Callisto's door. I said, puzzled, "Are you okay?" An angry voice shouted, "Leave me alone." Was she crying? Callisto did not leave her room the entire next morning. I had to go to the club, so I tiptoed to her door to tell her I was leaving. A disembodied voice shouted, "Great." I had no idea what made my neighbor so angry, so I said conciliatory, "We can talk about whatever is bothering you when you come back in the evening." All I heard was a muffled, "Fuck you, you asshole." It seems the problem was serious. Reproduction is a necessity if you want a species to survive. But men tend to perceive this process as an exclusively female ritual that does not concern them. That is, until they are pulled into the situation by wild emotional swings, crazy whims, and all the physical factors. Callisto was too early in her pregnancy to experience physical symptoms, and I never experienced emotional ones because Lisa and I didn't have children. So forgive me for some confusion from the new set of bats that have taken up residence in the head of my beautiful companion. I drove up to the club and parked the Alpha. Sonny sat on the terrace with a double espresso. Tourists crowded around, clicking their cameras as he sat, calmly enjoying the sea air and pretending that strange behavior was the norm whenever he went out in public. Maybe that's how it was. Sonny pushed up a chair as I passed his desk and said, "You look worried, old man. Sit down, let's talk." I looked doubtfully at the seething crowd and said, "Maybe it's better inside." For the first time, Sonny seemed to notice the excitement he was causing and said, "Sure, mate." He stood up and walked elegantly into the quiet interior of the club, still carrying his small cup. We sat in a booth, and I ordered a latte. He said, "Looks like you have a problem with Callisto." "How the hell does he do this?" "Sonny, let's call him by his real name." Apollo had many roles in the pantheon, including art, music, and, of course, the sun. But he also patronized the Delphic oracle, so he must have had prophetic powers. I said, "This woman is completely crazy. Last night we talked about my ex-wife's problems with fidelity. I even explained why I don't blame Lisa or her, given how they were manipulated." Apollo said, amazed, "You compared Callisto's situation to that of your ex-wife?" I said, "Of course, I compared it. I mean, none of them would have changed if they hadn't been the target of an aggressive man." Apollo let out one of his calm chuckles and said, "You mortals are so funny." That's where my patience ended. I got tired of all these cryptic statements and said, "What the hell do you mean? At first, Callisto goes crazy for no apparent reason, and now you find me funny." Apollo gave me one of his signature manly looks and said, "She's in love with you, buddy, and you just compared her to your cheating ex-wife. How did you expect her to react?" "What? Did Apollo just say that Callisto is in love with me?" This woman was in the same league as Apollo, not me. Apollo laughed softly again and said, "Yeah, she's in my league, and normally I'd hit on her. But she is carrying my father's child, and my father becomes insanely jealous if members of his family get involved with his victories." Apollo thoughtfully added, "With so many women with whom he has children, it would seem that the father would have long ago lost count of all those he has conquered." Apollo added in consolation, "But you have nothing to worry about. Dad will treat Callisto being with you the same way he would if she were with the family dog." "Thanks for the compliment." I said, "Let's get this straight. Do you think Callisto is in love with me?" Apollo said calmly, "Head over heels." I was stunned. I said, "Then why didn't she just tell me?" Apollo leaned across the table and said slyly, "She is carrying another man's child. My dad may be the king of the gods, but the fact remains, Callisto is not pregnant with your child. How do you think she's feeling? She's obviously conflicted." Apollo added with a mischievous sparkle in his eyes, "And then you compare her situation with how your wife, a woman of easy virtue, wanted to take revenge after sleeping with some mortal fool. You're lucky Callisto didn't shoot you. She's deadly with a bow, by the way." Oh my, talk about humiliation. It's probably just a nerdy thing. But I felt like I was always one step behind what was happening. At first, I thought that Paul would never be interested in my wife. Now I could not imagine that Callisto might have feelings for me. Apollo laughed and said, "You underestimate yourself, buddy. I know that Callisto is a rare beauty, but underneath all that beauty, she's just an Arcadian country girl. You are quite rich and handsome for a mortal. Plus, you saved her when she thought her world had collapsed, and since then you've treated her with respect as a partner, not as prey." He added, "Callisto has a lot of common sense, you know, so she came to the obvious conclusion you're great husband material, even if you're a little dense sometimes." Apollo leaned back, all in his golden splendor, and said, "You are both mortal, so I can understand why you communicate so poorly. But you two need to come to a common understanding as soon as possible, otherwise you will face a tragedy in the spirit of Sophocles." I found Callisto sitting in the peristyle garden of Artemis's mansion. She was wearing leggings and a t-shirt that said "Barrett" and a picture of Winnie the Pooh. She looked so amazing that I almost lost my resolve. But I remembered what Apollo said about her feelings for me, so I sat down next to her on the carved marble bench. She looked unhappy. Callisto turned her head towards me, her gaze became hard, and she said, "Go away, I don't want to talk to you." I tried to take her hand, but she quickly pulled it away. "Okay, I decided it's time to act." I said, "I want to apologize for being a tactful idiot. I know that your happy life has changed a lot, and you are scared. So the stupidest thing I could do was compare you to my ex-wife and her cheating." Callisto's face changed, from anger to interest. Maybe I'm not as stupid as she thought. I continued, "I don't see even the slightest resemblance to Lisa in you. She acted out of a selfish desire to please herself. This tells me everything I need to know about her fundamental inability to be committed to me and our marriage. You, on the contrary, have always been kind, sincere, and decent. Even now you blame yourself, which is completely illogical." Callisto's face brightened even more. I said, "Let me say one thing. I admire and respect you as a person, and I promise to be your true friend in any circumstances. Because you deserve it, you are worth it. I just want us to go back to our happy life together. So can you forgive the poor, clueless fool who never does anything right?" Her fiery emerald eyes studied my face. She seemed to be trying to figure out if I was lying. Finally, she said in her deliciously melodious voice, "Do you like men? What the—" I exclaimed, "Of course not. Why did you even come up with such a ridiculous question?" Callisto smiled her mysterious feminine smile and said, "What else should I think? We've been living together as husband and wife for the past 6 months, and you haven't even tried to hold my hand. I know I'm not as beautiful as Artemis, but most heterosexual men try to approach me sooner or later. Or do you find me that unattractive?" I just sat there with my mouth open. I behaved like a young noble knight because I thought Callisto was too tough for me, and she took my behavior as, "I'm not beautiful enough." Thank God for women's complexes. This levels the playing field so that we men can at least compete. I blurted out without thinking, "You are the most attractive woman I have ever met, mortal or not. It never occurred to me that you might want anything from me other than friendship. I know how much Zeus' actions destroy a woman's self-esteem, and I would sooner cut myself off, than cause you such pain. You are the most precious thing in the world to me." Callisto sat there, digesting my words. Then she seemed to melt away. She suddenly wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me, which, for the first time, I just reacted instead of doubting. Callisto let out a low, sensual moan as she stood up and tugged at my shirt. God, how strong she was. I realized that she remained innocent before Zeus took it from her. I also understood that her time with Zeus was the only sexual experience of her life. So I was stunned when she began to lead me towards our bedroom, with the air of a woman who had made up her mind. When we got to the bed, Callisto immediately lay down on her back. Is it true? I knew I had a certain nerdy charm, tall and quite burly, but there was no way I was in the same league as Callisto. This woman had a sensuality of almost unearthly depth and strength. But despite this gorgeous, purposeful woman clearly wanted to be with me. It was just incredible. We made love. After that, Callisto lay next to me, thoughtfully looking into space. We have clearly crossed a border beyond which we cannot return, and yet I had no idea where we were now. Finally, she looked at me and smiled softly, saying, "I guess you're confused." This was perhaps the biggest understatement since Jim Lovell said, "Houston, we have a problem." Callisto said, "You must understand and accept that I had never experienced sex in any form before Zeus came to me. In fact, I've always been a little afraid of it." "Okay, what's all this for?" Callisto smiled bitterly and continued, "He probably does this to every woman he seduces to enhance his pleasure. I think a lot of us were innocent, so we had no idea how to behave." Then Callisto stopped, as if she wanted me to accept her words as the truth. The moment Zeus started making love to me, I realized that I had all the instincts and reactions that an ordinary woman develops over the years. So I guess Zeus ended up giving me the gift of sex. Callisto fell silent and timidly asked, "Does this bother you?" The ethical and even physiological implications of her statement could occupy a whole college of philosophers for many years. But to be honest, I didn't care if Callisto's sexuality was the result of divine magic or years of selling the girlfriend experience. I was only interested in one thing, whether I had a future with her. I said, Significant events, even those that seem incredible, shape the lives of each of us. So it doesn't matter how you became who you are. All I care about is whether you and I can build our life together. Callisto laughed softly. It's time to be honest. Yes, Apollo told me in advance that Callisto thought she loved me, but I didn't know how much. Moreover, on the way back to our camp, I was already thinking through plans for the future. Long-term plans are scary plans. Reality seemed to become so impulsive and random that I was bombarded with one unexpected, life-changing event after another. However, it was clear that there was still one important question that needed to be asked. If I got the right answer to it, then the course of my life would be determined. I said, "You can recognize something important when you see it, know it's true, and decide to take action. That's why I'm going to do something crazy and tell you that I love you. I know that the child you are carrying can be an obstacle, but we can handle it if we're together, just you and me." Callisto seemed to have a hard time processing what I said, so I added, "We are both mortals, not gods. So there is nothing unusual in a man and woman building a life together. I don't know what this means for our friends at the Pantheon. I'd rather get on my boat and sail away from this soap opera. But I don't see that happening until the baby is born." Then I stopped and poured my heart into these words. When this happens, we will be much stronger as a unit than individually. Callisto, a stunning beauty and a brave huntress, looked like a little girl hoping the gift under the tree was for her as she said, "Are you talking about marriage?" I nodded vigorously. She asked, "But what about the child I'm carrying?" So that Callisto could appreciate my sincerity, I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Any child of Zeus will be a demigod, like Hercules. You've heard of him, haven't you?" Callisto looked at me with the expression, "Seriously?" and I continued, "The Pantheon will not trust us to raise such a child. Sooner or later, he would be taken to a place like Camp Half-Blood." Callisto started crying women. "I guess it's maternal instinct," I said soothingly. "The kid will probably be a teenager by the time he's taken away, like Percy Jackson, and by then we'll probably be happy to be rid of him. Most parents do this." Callisto laughed. I added, "In the meantime, we both have our own lives, and I'm telling you that I want to live it with you." Callisto looked at me sharply and said, "If you swear to me, it must be for life. Because I will belong to only one man. This is a sacred promise, so you better think twice before you talk about marriage. That's what you're talking about, right?" I said. I had convincing evidence that women cannot be trusted. But my primitive brain tells me that I can trust you. You are sweet, kind, practical, and care about other people. I can't think of anyone I'd rather spend my life with than you. So yes, I'm talking about marriage. Callisto rushed at me, bursting into tears. Yes, and so the second round began. Usually what happens at this point is, "And they lived happily ever after." But my story was written by Aeschylus, or maybe Aristophanes, a tragedy or a comedy. One or the other. And yet we are talking about the Greek pantheon, where the human condition is elevated into one gigantic chaos. Apollo married us in the chapel of Agios Ionis Theologos. He got one of those internet licenses from some church in the States, so it was a civil ceremony, not a pagan one. A couple of girls from the club were Callisto's bridesmaids, and my best man was Dionysus, yes, the same one. Dionysus had sobered up for a while for the event, and he was pretty cool when he wasn't drunk, though. It was best not to think about the bachelor party. After that, Callisto and I returned to the life we were already leading. Naxos has an almost ideal climate, sunny and mild, with just enough rain to avoid becoming completely dry. Callisto and I worked at the club and spent time together, often on my boat. We traveled to the local islands from Santorini to Mykonos and enjoyed a variety of cultures while we waited for the baby. I quickly stopped noticing Callisto's exceptional beauty because she was such a sweet, loving, down-to-earth, simple girl. In addition, she was a very colorful person. For example, Callisto still loved hunting, so sometimes, around dinner time, she would emerge from the forest with her prize casually slung over her shoulder, looking like an ordinary housewife returning from the supermarket. Callisto grew larger as her due date approached, but this did not at all interfere with her sexual abilities. She was full of energy, with a great imagination, and all the knowledge that Zeus had downloaded to her during their first sexual experience. We took Lamaze classes at Naxos Health Center like any normal couple and were as prepared as possible. And then one day, I heard a little exclamation from my wife, and the game began. Naturally, when it comes to the Pantheon, nothing ordinary happens. So Artemis and her companions showed up just as we were about to start the 8-mile trek to the Naxos hospital. The goddess waved me back to the garage and said sharply, "We'll take care of everything ourselves." She then led Callisto back into the house. It was absolutely clear that there would be no modern methods in this birth. Everything will happen the old-fashioned way as women have endured it since time immemorial. Of course, one of Artemis' roles in the Pantheon was to ensure the safety of the woman and child during childbirth. In fact, according to myth, as soon as Artemis was born, she helped her mother Leto give birth to her twin brother Apollo. So I was confident that Callisto was in the best and most reliable hands. All I could do was wait. I looked up at the Aegean night sky. There is no light pollution like in large cities like Athens. The sky was full of millions of sparkling points of light. I was looking for familiar constellations, those that everyone recognizes. Orion, with his belt of 3 stars pointing to the North Star in nearby Ursa Minor, caught my attention. All this was invented by the Greeks thousands of years ago. Yet these star symbols and the myths they represent are the common thread that binds humanity into one river that has flowed continuously since the beginning of time. The cry of the newborn announced his arrival to the world. I didn't know if there was any etiquette required at the birth of a demigod, such as handing out cigars to the gods of his new family. I guess. Cigars seem a bit of a weak gesture, considering this little guy is going to have godlike powers. Then Artemis and her 5 companions appeared, looking like women who had just completed an ordinary, everyday task. Artemis was wearing a medical gown like the others and was holding a small man wrapped in a blanket in her arms. He looked at me carefully, already fully aware of himself and ready to face the world. Artemis said, "It's a boy, Ryan. His name is Arcas." Callisto named him after the region of Greece where she is from. I looked at the baby. He had Callisto's green eyes and a shock of red hair. His tiny body already had masculine features. It was clearly Zeus. Obviously, he was not my son, but I made a promise to his mother, and I'm not going back on my commitment, so he was mine to raise. Artemis must have guessed what I was thinking because she said sadly, "I just wanted to show you the baby before I take your wife and newborn." This blow was like touching a high-voltage line. For the first time, I felt the difference between a marriage with Lisa and a marriage with Callisto. I left Lisa with regret and sadness, but I knew what needed to be done, and I handled it without unnecessary drama. Still, the thought of losing Callisto was killing me. I said, sounding like a petulant child, "Why, it's easy to be brave when nothing important is at stake. Try to be strong when your whole life depends on it." Artemis looked at me with sympathy and said, "I have to do this to protect them both. Hera is beside herself with rage and is going to take revenge." I said tiredly, "I understand. I think any older woman whose husband has an affair would feel the same way." Artemis nodded in agreement and added, "So to get revenge on Callisto, Hera wants me to turn her into a bear." "Seriously? Bear? Why doesn't the old woman deal with the real culprit, her wandering hubby? And in general, why a bear?" Artemis grinned. "In ancient times, bears were sacred to people, and Hera has still not moved away from the times when we all lived on Olympus. She's very old-fashioned, you know. So I left a big angry brown bear in the house. Hera will think that I fulfilled her request." Obviously, this meant it was time for me to move out. Artemis finished. "I'm going to hide your wife and her child in the same cave on Mount Zas where Zeus was born. This is a completely wild area." She added, "I'll stay with Callisto until Hera finds another unfortunate woman to take her anger out on." I'm sure I won't have to wait long, given my father's lustful nature. I will return it to you as soon as I am sure that you can live without fear of divine vengeance. That's how it all turned out. The good news was that my love would be safe and would one day return to me. The bad news is I didn't know when it would happen. And what was even worse was that I would have to survive without my best friend and faithful companion all this time. I understood and accepted that Artemis did what was best for Callisto and me. I should have been grateful. But the feeling of complete emptiness, as if the scorched earth stretched out in front of me, was comparable to traveling through a waterless desert, and I was deprived of all hope. Artemis drove me to the Argo. She was still the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But now there was a feeling of inevitability in her, a feeling that everything that happened was predetermined. Probably all gods are like that. Their power is endless, and your fate is in their hands. This forces you to be careful in your words and actions when you are around them. I said sincerely. Thank you for everything you've done for me, and please take care of Callisto. My life would end if I lost her, and that's exactly how I felt. The goddess looked touched and said, Fate unfolds in ways that you mortals cannot understand. But from my point of view, there are always the same basic rules. You lead a worthy life and receive a reward. You do bad things and you pay for them. Artemis smiled and added, So if you continue on the same path, your well-deserved reward will await you sooner or later. In the meantime, you need to go somewhere else. I would suggest Egypt. That family is older than ours. But Anubis, Set, and Apep are very bad guys. My friend Bastet could help you if you have any problems. I said, No, thank you. Now there is a war going on in that part of the world. And besides the fact that I may encounter the ancient gods, I also do not want to die due to modern conflicts. Then it dawned on me. I said, What about the Celts? After all, they had their own separate group of gods. Are they part of your family? Artemis looked at me the way people look at people who take the wheels off their house to move to another trailer park. She said, Certainly, but we have our own version of rabble, and these gods are from the most backward system in the entire galaxy. Then a thought struck her, and she added, Families like the Egyptians or ours would never get involved with hillbillies like Cernunnos, Tyrannes, or Epona, so this is the perfect place for you to lay low. She added that this included the north of France and the UK purely Celtic places. Places like Gaul and Britain were the fringes of civilization during the golden age of the Pantheon. But now there are no better places than Paris or London, so I said. Thank you, my dear friend, and I hope you will inform me as soon as it is safe to return Callisto. Artemis looked sad when we parted, but this was not the sadness of a woman losing her lover. Rather, it resembled the reaction of a man who had just learned that Pa was going to shoot Old Yeller. The next day, I crossed the pier where the Argo was moored and submitted my resignation. Apollo said, We'll miss you, old man. You were quite useful for a mortal, but I understand why you need to leave. Hera becomes increasingly strange and medieval as my father continues to wander around the Mediterranean. He added, You will be safe in this god-forsaken barbarian wilderness in the north. Apollo spoke about England. I wondered what millennium he even lived in. But on the other hand, Apollo is the god of the sun, and the sun rarely shines on the British Isles. So I bought a ticket for the flight after arranging a long-term layover for the Argo. The connecting flight went to Alexandria and from there to Heathrow. Sam Johnson once said, If you're tired of London, you're tired of life. This was my condition. When you have as much money as I did, the only problem is deciding which area of town to live in. In the end, I chose a luxury apartment in Southwark, next to London Bridge, overlooking the Thames. 2 lonely years passed as I tried to cope with hopelessness. As Fitzgerald once said, In the dark night of the soul, it is always 3 o'clock in the morning. This was my situation. The emotional vacuum created when Callisto disappeared from my life left me searching for anything to fill that void. I finally decided I couldn't go on anymore without something I could love, so I got a dog. This was the best option possible. I was directed to a small shop on the A1 north of Hampstead Heath. I was a little worried when I arrived because the place looked more like a bicycle repair shop than an animal shelter. But inside, I met the warmest and kindest people. The adoption process was no less rigorous than if I were going to raise a child. I was tested and then allowed to meet my potential new best friend. Here you could choose a dog for every taste, from a small one that would fit in your pocket to the most ridiculous-looking shepherd. Yes, I know, almost all shepherds look ridiculous. But what caught my attention was a huge guy who was lying on the floor, turned away from the other dogs. They were all trying to get my attention. This dog lowered his head on his paws and looked completely devastated. My heart sank for him, because I felt exactly the same. I asked the volunteer, "And what about this?" He replied, "You don't need Buster, sir." I asked, "Why? Is he aggressive?" The volunteer laughed and said, "He's not like that at all. This poor guy lost his owner, and now he's just lying here and being sad. Dogs do this when they lose those they are attached to. We're going to euthanize him next week. It will be better this way." I walked over and sat on the floor next to the dog. He was big, ugly, and smelled strongly of dogs. He looked like a mixture of a mastiff and a couple of other large breeds. He looked at me with his eyes full of fatigue and sadness. I began to stroke his wrinkled head between his tattered ears and said, "I know how you feel, friend. There are people who don't understand what dogs say. I feel sorry for them." This dog made it clear. "You have no idea how I feel, boss. My man is dead, and all I can do is go after him." I said sadly, "Oh yes, buddy, I understand you. I too lost the only person I've ever loved, so I know how you feel right now." The dog's look said, "You too," and I added, "I will never stop mourning her." As Bogart once said, this was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Dogs are the best medicine for people who have lost hope. Their unwavering devotion and unconditional love, their empathetic spirit penetrates your inner chaos and begins to restore you. You are never alone if you have a dog, and Buster was a true friend and companion. We often walked along Queen's Walk to Tower Bridge, and then along the Thames to South Bank. Buster would sit at my feet while I drank a pint at one of the street tables on Bankside, heavy breathing, drops of saliva, and the two of us enjoyed our friendship. Buster was still grieving for his former master, and I couldn't get thoughts of Callisto out of my head. We discussed our losses. Well, I guess I did most of the talking, but Buster was a good listener, and he understood because he'd been through it himself. One day, we had a conversation that I would call Paulin, although perhaps I was just talking to myself. You know how it is. A sudden realization that strikes like lightning. Actually, Buster started it all by saying, "I can't do anything about my situation, boss. My old master won't come back. But your wife is out there somewhere, so why don't you try to find her?" I thought for a minute, and it dawned on me. All my actions were determined by what Artemis told me that fateful night. Otherwise, I would never have left Callisto. I mean, Artemis is a goddess. She had to know what she was talking about. But almost 3 years passed, and I didn't hear anything from her. So I had to stop being a coward and go after my wife. Honestly, it couldn't get any worse than this. I'm having deep, personal conversations with my dog. So I had no choice. I had to go back to Naxos, climb that mountain, and find Callisto. The journey to the ferry terminal on Naxos was a grueling 2-day ordeal. I could have flown there in a few hours, but I couldn't leave Buster, and I didn't have the heart to pack him into a cage. So we traveled by train from London to Athens, and then traveled almost 5 hours on the ferry from Piraeus to Naxos. We arrived in Naxos in the afternoon in Buster, and I caught a taxi that took us around the bay to the Naxian Utopia Hotel. I could go into the club and ask Apollo or Dionysus for the keys to Artemis's villa. But my goal was to leave Naxos with Callisto or die trying. I didn't know how these two hot-tempered gods would react if I just showed up 2 years later. The Naxian Utopia Hotel is a top-tier luxury resort, but we weren't there for comfort. Luckily, I paid for everything in advance because the front desk was a little hesitant when they saw my roommate. However, it's amazing what a few extra €100 can do. The next morning, I rented an ancient Suzuki Vitara from Wheels 4U Rental. I brought all the equipment I would need for the climb and was dressed like a tourist. We drove along a winding creek road, climbing into the mountains. Buster kept sticking his head out of the window, sticking his tongue out into the wind like a flag. The road ended at an ancient spring that became a tourist attraction where you could park. The hiking route began with a steep mountain pass. The final destination was marked out for any hiker crazy enough to attempt the climb. Even Buster, with his 4 paws, had difficulty climbing the rocky slope. We reached a deserted mountain plateau, in front of which rose a huge protruding rock. The Naxians fenced off the space under this ledge with a wall and made a door in case someone did not understand that this was supposedly the cave where Zeus lived as a child. The path to the door was a short but steep climb, covered with slippery stones that could easily twist your ankle. I didn't know what was waiting for me, and of course it was a little crazy. I imagined that I would walk into the cave, loudly announce, "Honey, I'm home," and Callisto would run out to meet me with a hug and a kiss just like in the old sitcom. Artemis said that she took Callisto here to protect her from Hera, and I could easily understand why this place acted as a hideout. There was nothing here but a narrow mountain expanse and a cold wind blowing through the pass. The emptiness of this place made me feel like my mission was doomed to failure. But I traveled 3 days to get here, and I had to find out what was behind the door. The entrance was so low that I had to duck to enter. I turned on my hand torch and illuminated the cave. There was nothing there but an abandoned stone hall. Not a single sign of human habitation. It showed me how out of touch I was with reality. I sighed in disappointment. This was the end of the road. There was no happy ending in sight. Buster commented dryly. "So what now, boss?" I, depressed, replied, "We return home and live the rest of our lives without those we love." I turned around and struggled back into the sunlight, where I came across a giant damn Scorpio. Most scorpions are 5 or 6 inches long. This one was about 4 feet tall. He stood in a classic fighting stance, claws raised, tail curved over his back, stinger pointed directly at me. This creature was so incredible that it immediately became clear God was clearly involved here. Buster came out of the cave, saw a scorpion, shouted, "Crap," and pressed himself against the wall next to me. It was obvious that the creature was here to kill us, and there was no point in dealing with him in words arachnids are not inclined to rational discussions. Buster growled, preparing to fight, and said, "I'll hold him off as long as I can, boss, and you run." You can learn a lot from dogs, especially their sense of duty and self-sacrifice. But I firmly stated, "I'm not running away, buddy. We're in this together." I grabbed a large tree branch that could be used as a club. The plan was simple to make the creature pay for us, strike us on the head or break a pair of its 8 legs. The situation was completely hopeless. The scorpion made ominous clicking sounds as it approached us. Buster took a fighting position, muscles tense, head hung low, teeth bared. I stood holding my baton, ready to strike, like a baseball player preparing to hit the ball out of the stadium. And then something suddenly flew in and hit the scorpion. The arrow didn't just pierce the scorpion, it literally exploded inside it, as if it were a javelin missile destroying a Russian tank. Buster and I might have been covered in scorpion goo if the creature's hard exoskeleton hadn't kept everything inside. I looked in the direction where the arrow came from and saw Artemis, who was just putting her bow behind her back. Behind the goddess stood the most beautiful woman in the world. My wife looked both nervous and happy. The scene that unfolded next was reminiscent of a romantic comedy with a sickly sweet plot. The circumstances of the moment were so melodramatic and unbelievable that it looked like a script from a Cameron Crowe movie. Callisto ran down the hill towards me graceful, fast like a doe. I, much less agile, climbed up to meet her, holding out my arms. We met midway. I picked my wife up in my arms, and we kissed with the passion that we had been saving for 2 years. We held this kiss for a long time, enjoying each other's happiness. I then carefully lowered Callisto to the ground, and we looked at our 2 companions. Artemis glowed with pleasure, and Buster relieved himself on a nearby stone. Artemis sternly said, "Didn't I warn you to stay away?" I answered firmly, "I had no choice. You know the old biblical truth. The Lord helps those who help themselves. I, of course, associate with a Greek pantheon, but the rules are the same. I couldn't sit back like a passive loser and hope that fate would work things out for me. The stakes were too high." Artemis laughed and said, "Then today is your lucky day. This scorpion was here to kill you. My father knew that you would appear sooner or later, and he was not used to sharing. But Lachesis does not like my father, and she told me that you are here. Lachesis is the middle of the three sister fates, the one that measures the length of life. Apparently, she decided to give me some more thread. I, hugging Callisto, said, "Honestly, I would rather die than live without her." Artemis, beaming, replied, "You won't have to." The goddess continued, "The myth says that I turned Callisto into a bear to save her from Hera, which is basically what I did, and then the bear became the constellation Ursa Major. You were killed by my father's scorpion, and he, in turn, turned you into the constellation Orion. Now, every night the constellation Scorpio chases Orion across the sky. This is exactly how it should have happened." Artemis was right. This is exactly what myth and cosmogony say. Stunned, I said, "But that didn't happen here." Artemis smiled a sly cat smile and said, "Everything happened exactly as it was written, at least for my father, Hera, and the eternal myth. I just made a small amendment to the plot. You were a good friend, Ryan." Then Artemis's face instantly transformed, acquiring a divine radiance. "How does she manage to transform so quickly?" she said. "Now you can both live your lives without the interference of my crazy family. Just stay away from these places forever, okay?" The hardest decision after that was choosing where to put down roots. The obvious choice was the States, but Callisto loved hot climates and hunting, and I couldn't imagine her in a bar somewhere in Texas or Arizona or chatting with older gentlemen in Florida. We could go straight back to the UK, where she would certainly feel at home. But the weather there is a nightmare, so I suggested that we take a drive around the Mediterranean and find a place that felt right. The only condition was that it be located away from areas associated with the Greek pantheon. We left the breakwater at Naxos less than an hour after meeting Artemis. The Argo was still in port waiting for us, and I couldn't think of a better way to leave Naxos than to get on board and get away as quickly as possible. It was clear to both of us that we urgently needed to leave the city. Our first stop was Heraklion on Crete. We were still not far from Greek territory, but I planned to reach Alexandria the next day and believed that we had a small margin of time before they started looking for us. I did not plan to stay in Crete, but I thought that we could move along the African coast under the protection of another group of gods, Egyptian or Carthaginian. Especially the Carthaginian ones, it's better not to mess with them. Baal literally breathes fire, and Tanith and Astarte preferred human sacrifices. For Olympians, it would be like walking into a bad neighborhood. We stopped for the night in the shallow waters of Heraklion Bay, east of the city's port. I launched the motorboat and went ashore to resupply while Callisto got used to the boat. She had never been on a ship like the Argo before and needed to get comfortable on board. Buster came with me because, well, you know what he needed to do. I walked Buster, loaded the boat with all the delicacies I could from the Sklavenitis supermarket, which was a short walk from the beach, and returned to the Argo before dinner. We ate a stacca lobster pasta in tomato sauce with cheese, and for dessert we had galactabarico. I then poured Callisto a glass of Athlone Asiatico from Santorini, and we settled into the luxurious Benito sofas, watching the sun set over a city that has been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years. Callisto turned to me with her sparkling emerald eyes and said, "I need to explain." "What?" No man likes to hear these four words, but I found the courage to answer. "I'm sure you need this," Callisto said. "The night we parted was both beautiful and terrible. I loved Arcas, but I lost you. Arcas needed time to adapt to life. Therefore, for the first 3 months, I and the rest of the girls, She spoke about Artemis's companions, Anticle, Procris, Siren, Philenomus, and Atalanta. We lived in the very cave that you just visited. I was in this cave. No one but a Neanderthal could live there. Callisto noticed the expression on my face and added, "What you saw was a skillfully created camouflage. The real living quarters are deeper into the mountain." My wife continued, "Artemis's family hollowed out the entire top of Mount Zeus to protect themselves during the war with the Titans, and everything there is arranged in comfort. This explained the myth of the Olympians. Arcus was hidden in an artificial cave, just like the baby Zeus once was." Callisto continued, "Eventually, Artemis moved us all to her hunting lodge in the mountains west of the Temple of Demeter. There, I spent 2 years helping Arcus prepare for his future role as ruler of my home region in the Peloponnese." I gave her a look that said, "2 years old?" Callisto laughed cheerfully and said, "No, stupid, the Olympians have their own development program for demigods. Your arrival in the cave coincided with a moment when Arcus was taken to Olympus. Perhaps the fates arranged this in advance. I know that Clotho is especially skilled and cunning in that which she spins." I asked, "Didn't the fact that Arcus disappeared kill you?" Callisto looked at me sadly and said with regret, "I could never truly become attached to my son. I think it's because he was more of a god than a man. However, in my defense, I can say that Arcus was not particularly eager to communicate with me. He spent all his time with Artemis and Apollo." I said, "Then we should start creating some mortal children to replace them." Callisto's face changed from sad to an expression of hunger. She said, "Why don't you put that stinking dog on deck, and we'll get started right now?" And she playfully raised her thick copper eyebrows. I explained to Buster that he would have to sit outside for a while. He answered cheerfully, "No problem, boss. I already understood that she was in the hunt. Well, he's a dog after all." I closed the hatch into the cabin and turned around to see a sight that almost brought tears to my eyes. My wife was standing in the middle of the cabin. The silvery light of the large Mediterranean moon illuminated her beautiful forms. This was the first time in almost 3 years that we were together again as husband and wife. You can imagine what a whirlwind of emotions raged in my head. It was the moment when all my hopeless dreams came true. We ended up settling near Porto, Portugal. All the omens pointed to this place. Its climate, culture, and history, including the Celtiberian and Punic pantheons, were particularly brutal. Highly civilized Greeks would never have messed with this. Thus, we were out of reach of the lustful patriarch of the Olympian aristocracy and his crazy wife. Forever. The best thing was that we were able to get there by boat without having to risk crossing the Bay of Biscay. I used some of my ill-gotten gains to buy a villa on a hill overlooking the Douro River. My trusty Argo was moored in a marina on the river nearby, and the wild nature in the mountains east of the city gave Callisto plenty of space to roam. It was perfect. Because of my experiences with women, both the nerdy and the divine, I firmly believed, when your cup is overflowing, watch out. Everything was too perfect, so the worm of suspicion began to gnaw at my brain. This happens to any person who has been betrayed. Paranoia, perhaps. But Callisto was too pretty to be just the wife of a Greek god. Therefore, she obviously attracted incredible attention from Portuguese men. Plus, my wife was more comfortable in the woods than Grizzly Adams, whereas my idea of hardship is if all the 5-star hotels in town are booked and I have to stay in a 4-star hotel. Hence potential compatibility issues. Callisto spent years walking around the club wearing Cyclades in tight leggings and a sports bra, so she got used to stares. But wherever we went, some idiot was sure to try his luck. Callisto either sent them away with a grin or with extreme prejudice, depending on their persistence. But I was once betrayed by a woman who couldn't even be compared to Callisto, and old insecurities kept resurfacing. Then my wife started acting strange, just like Lisa. We were rarely apart, except for her hunting trips. It could have been a day or two in the wilderness in the mountains. She always took Buster with her, just in case, and he never reported anything. But our harmony began to break down, and tension appeared between us. I didn't know how. No, honestly, I didn't want to face what I thought was happening. I knew Callisto would think I was an idiot if I just sat down and asked, "Well, who are you sleeping with?" This would be the fastest and most reliable way to lose her. I loved this woman, and such a question implies worldwide disrespect. However, my sixth sense was going crazy, so one soft and sensual evening, almost the only kind of evening that Portugal has. We sat on the cozy terrace in front of the fireplace and sipped aged port. The feeling that there was a secret between us was palpable. Finally, I said, "I love you, Callisto. You should know this." She looked at me in surprise, so I continued, "What are you hiding from me? Just tell me, I can handle it." Callisto seemed to gather her courage. Then she said, "What I didn't tell you when we got back together was that being pregnant and giving birth to Zeus's child had affected my reproductive system. All the girls, even Artemis, thought that I could never bear a child for you." Then she paused for a moment and continued, "I love you so much that I just couldn't let this get in the way of our happiness. That's why I didn't tell you." It was new information, but it didn't matter. I loved Callisto. End of story. But then again, I'm a man, and men don't think like women. In Callisto's head, what good is she if she can't give me a child? Ridiculous, I know. But men's brains run on Windows, while women's brains run on iOS. So communication is always a problem. Well, it was a blow, and who cares about the descendants if I have Callisto? But wait, that's not all. Callisto took my hand, raised it to her lips, and kissed it. Then she said, "Look at me." I looked straight into her huge, intelligent eyes. My wife said, "They were all wrong. I waited a couple of months to be sure. But now that you asked, the secret I've been keeping from you is that you're going to be a father." Instant shame for my thoughts, followed by a huge burst of joy. The connection has been completed. We will raise the child together. The love of a good woman is the first of the 3 pillars of life. The second is to lead a meaningful life. And the third, raising a child with a woman you love, is perhaps the most precious gift of all because it symbolizes hope and the future. I was the happiest person on earth. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.